Good evening and welcome to this conditional use hearing held by Swarthmore Borough Council. I am Mary Walk, Council President, and I'm going to ask the other people up here with me, council members, mayor, and borough manager and solicitor, to please introduce yourselves.
My name is Bill Webb. I'm the borough manager.
And I'm Marty Spiegel. I'm mayor of Swarthmore.
Hi, Kristen Seymour, Scarlett Cahill, council member. Sarah Graydon, council vice president.
Robert Scott, borough solicitor.
Jill Gajewski, council member.
Branson Halderman, council member.
David Bowden, council member.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to the borough solicitor, Robert Scott, who is going to give us some ground rules for this evening's hearing, and he is going to be running the hearing for most of it. So thank you, Mr. Scott.
Thank you. So the purpose of this hearing is solely for council to decide if, quote, demolition of buildings will not have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center, end quote. This is going to be a formal evidentiary hearing. Parties will have an opportunity to present testimony and evidence in support of their positions and to cross-examine each other and other parties' witnesses. We have a court reporter keeping a transcript of this hearing in case the party wants to appeal. And because we have a court reporter, it's really important that people not talk over each other. And please note, clapping or yelling from, just we need to really make sure everybody can be heard their full sentences. As an initial matter, the council will consider requests for official party status. To be entitled to party status, a person must demonstrate that he or she has a substantial direct and immediate interest in this matter. In order to have a substantial interest, there must be some discernible adverse effect to some interest other than an abstract interest of all citizens in the matter. I know that sounds legalistic, and it is because that's the standard. So in other words, to qualify for official party status, you need to demonstrate that this is going to affect you or your property, and proximity is really essential to that kind of call. Persons granted party status are entitled to present testimony and evidence and will have standing to appeal a decision if they are unhappy with the decision. The Pennsylvania rules of evidence do not apply in conditional use hearings, but irrelevant, immaterial, and unduly repetitive evidence may be excluded. The applicant will go first and present its case. Other parties that are recognized as parties will then put on their cases. It's the intention of council to conclude tonight at or around 10 p.m. If additional time is needed, the hearing will be continued to 7 p.m. on Tuesday, May 24th. And if still additional time is needed, it will be continued again to Wednesday, May 25th, next week. After all the parties have presented their cases and cross-examined the other parties' witnesses, there will be an opportunity for public comment for residents and taxpayers of Swarthmore who are not parties. And that will happen at the conclusion, which means it may or may not happen tonight, because if we continue this because parties haven't completed their cases tonight, the public comment period won't happen until the end of everybody's case. So those are the ground rules for tonight. As an additional matter, the borough is going to introduce two exhibits to demonstrate that this hearing was properly advertised on May 6th and April 29th, which would be copies of the Swarthmorean. And that will be exhibits B1 and B2, please. And exhibit B3 will be an affidavit of posting, which is an affidavit signed by the borough manager stating that he posted both properties with the notice of this hearing and photographs of that posting. So that will be exhibit B3. And with that, oh, good point. I think what I'm going to suggest is that council allow parties to do their cross-examination before you ask questions. So you can hold your questions until parties in the audience have had a chance to. So,
The parties in the audience.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other points? Does anybody have any other clarification? Anybody wants to?
Anybody up here?
So, questions from council after party cross before public comment?
Yes.
Yeah. And there probably will not be public comment tonight because it's coming at the very end. Okay.
So with those exhibits introduced, I'd like to ask if anybody would like to be recognized as a party. Yes. If you'd please step to the mic and introduce yourself.
Kevin McGowan. I'm here on behalf of Shannon Elliott and Mel Rothbart, Chris Kenny, and Martha Perkins. Good evening, members of the board, Mr. Mayor, Borough Manager Webb, Solicitor Scott. We are here requesting party status on this conditional use hearing based on proximity and a pending zoning hearing board appeal pending before the Swarthmore Borough Zoning Hearing Board. Shannon Elliott owns and operates a business at 102-104 Park Avenue, one of the buildings subject to the hearing. Mel Rothbart lives within 1 mile of the buildings at 544 Westminster Avenue. Chris Kenny lives within half a mile of the buildings at 321 Park Avenue. And Martha Perkins lives with less than 1 mile from the buildings at 422 Park Avenue. These members are represented collectively by the Save Our Swarthmore entity. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anybody else? I'll address you in just a second. Is there anybody else that wishes party status? So 2. Is that anybody else? 3. Okay. So I'm going to recommend that Mr. McGowan be granted party status on the basis, and that SOS be granted party status because 2 of its members have a business on the block that's clearly within the proximity that I think is understanding. The other 2 members, I'm not so sure that their proximity qualifies, but I think it's a moot point if your other 2 members do. So I will recommend that council, if there's no objection, I would recommend that party status be granted.
Are there any objections from council?
Objection.
None.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And why don't we go from my right to left?
Albert Richardson, 114 Park.
I couldn't hear your first name, please.
Albert.
Albert, thank you. And I'm sorry, your address?
114 Park. I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to try to follow his model. I request party status. I live 15 feet from the property line of 112 Park.
Well, as I said, proximity matters, and I can't argue with that.
I have a great view now.
So, I'll recommend again that Mr. Richardson be given party status unless there's an objection.
Are there any objections from council? Hearing none.
Okay. So,
Hi, my name is Julie Ellis. I live at 128 Park Avenue on the 100 block. I work for the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine, and I have an office both in my home and at Kennett Square. I've also been known to work remotely from Hobbs. As a resident of the 100 block of Park Avenue, I am a near neighbor to the proposed condo project, and I am a member of the Swarthmore Borough Environmental Advisory Council.
yeah, again,
Requesting party status.
thank you. Again, and how many buildings away are your residents?
And 4?
Again, I think that proximity is clearly within the bounds, and would recommend party status unless there's an objection.
Any objections?
Okay, and the last was Mr. Federico.
Al Federico, 133 Rutgers Avenue. I live on the back end within 500 feet of the property, actually probably the same distance as Julie.
All right, that sounds, works for me, so.
Any objections? None.
Thank you.
Mr. Petrolia.
Yes, sir. I don't know if you Is there a time frame you move this one up here? So, you want to let them?
Do you want to go the rest of it together?
I'm sorry, was there another,
They just raised their hand in red shirt.
to request party status?
Yes.
Okay. Were you going to raise an objection or?
Yeah, only really, I'm sorry, I'm a little hard time being heard through this. A clarification with regard to Melanie Rothbard and Christopher Kane. I understand that your ruling was that they are not entitled to individual status, but as members of SOS, they participate through SOS.
That's correct.
All right, that was the only clarification.
And I'm sorry, Ms. Dow, was it?
Seriously.
No, my name is Liz Dow. I live at 132 Park Avenue next to Julie.
Sorry, the address again?
132 Park Avenue.
That's on this beautiful. So this is consistent with the others, so I'm going to recommend.
Any objections? No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so that is 5 parties that have been recognized as parties.
Right now, we're doing the party status. Is there anyone else who wanted to come up and apply for party status?
Okay, with that,
I saw it.
My name's Virginia Scott. I live at 525 Rutgers Avenue, and I would love to apply for party status, but I need a point of clarification as well. I do not live on the 100 block of Park Avenue. I have a feeling your determination is going to be that I do not qualify for party status, but I would like to ask where the cutoff point is and why people who frequent the borough, have lived in the borough, vote for all of you people, would not be able to apply for party status. And I can stand here or...
well, that's fine. It's because that's what the case law has determined. There is a statute that governs this. It says that in the cases that deal with party status, they all have to do with proximity.
So where is proximity? This is my question.
It is a judgment call, but the people who want party status need to show that they have some interest that is discernible from the general population.
Even in a small town such as ours?
Yes.
So where would you cut it off?
In my thinking,
just for the benefit of other people who might be like on the cusp here.
It's a judgment call. I think that the blocks that touch it, if you're living on Park Avenue, you have a business on Park Avenue, clearly more affected than somebody that lives 5 blocks away.
Okay, thank you. I really just wanted to know that for the record. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So with that, we're going to let the applicant present its case.
Thank you. Would you prefer me here or here?
I think we can hear you better from there. Maybe that's my imagination, but I think I can hear better from right here.
By way of opening statement, I'm going to try to shorten it a bit because I think you've already laid out pretty much what the issue is in this case. We're seeking a conditional use approval to allow the demolition of 4 buildings at 102-104 and 110-112 Park Avenue. The ordinance requires conditional use approval for demolition of any structures.
You need to introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, my name is Donald Petrosa. I'm the attorney representing the applicant.
Thank you.
And as you know, the applicants, I'll say their name once and then we can just refer to them as the applicant. But it is 110 Park Avenue owner LLC and 112 Park Avenue LP are the owners or equitable owners of all of the property involved The property involved is 102-104 and 110-112 Park Avenue. What I was going to say is that 102-104 Park Avenue, I think that the building may actually be 102, but we'll just refer to it as 102-104 because that's the way it's referred to in some of the borough documents. With regard to 110-12, the whole property is known as 110-112, but the building in the front is known as 110. The building in the rear is known as 112. The two buildings that are in the Historic Resources Survey are the front buildings in both cases. So it would be 110 and the front building on 102-104 Park Avenue. There are a couple of buildings in the rear. There's some garages behind 102-104 Park Avenue on the same property. And there's 112, which is a more modern building located behind the 110, which I think was the site of a restaurant for a brief period of time. So those are the properties that are subject to the application. We're seeking conditional use approval because the ordinance requires conditional use approval in order to demolish any of the buildings. We have a little bit more of a hurdle with regard to the two that are on the Historic Resources study, and the standard is, as your solicitor set forth, whether or not demolishing those buildings would have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center. We do have, the zoning permit has been issued by the zoning officer, which is an indication that the zoning officer has determined that the project complies with all zoning requirements and the zoning ordinance, including all the requirements of Chapter 1256. I don't really want to get into it, but there's an appeal of that determination, which will be handled by the zoning hearing board. But for your purposes, there is a valid zoning permit which has determined that we comply with all of the requirements of Chapter 1256, which is the town center regulations, as well as the other zoning regulations. What we propose to do this evening is to present testimony. I think we'll have 4 witnesses. I've handed up anticipated exhibit packets. We can also show the relevant exhibits on the screen. I don't think we need to show the deeds and that sort of thing for standing. And I provided Mr. Gowan, opposing counsel, with a copy of the exhibits and sort of all out of exhibits. I think you all have a copy as well. But we'll be able to show them on the screen for people in the audience. And I anticipate calling 4 witnesses. Obviously, it's our position that demolishing these buildings for the purposes of redevelopment for a use in a building which has been determined to meet all the requirements of the zoning ordinance will not have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center. And we're planning on calling 4 witnesses. There are 3 principals who are involved in the applicants, and those principals are William Cumbie Jr., William Cumbie III, and Donald Delson. Now, just to try to keep this in a reasonable time frame, we're going to present testimony from one of those 3 principals, who is Bill Cumbie III. There may be some occasion where something pops up where one of the other gentlemen needs to testify, but right at this point, we're proposing to present testimony from Bill Cumbie III. We also plan to present testimony from Susanna Morikawa, who is sort of a local historian, as I'm sure you know, and from Laura Meminger, who's a former chairman of the Planning Commission, and actually worked for the company that did the revitalization study to try to figure ways to improve the town center. Some brief testimony from Laura. And then Dorothy Ives Dewey, who is a land planner and a professor at Westchester University, who will testify. So that's our planned presentation to you, and unless you have any questions of me, I'll move on into the testimony. The first witness is William.
What's your preference?
I think he'd be fine
I
here.
think it's best he be in front of a microphone.
Park, yeah. That's okay. Okay, this is William Covey III.
Could you say your full name, please?
William Cumbie III.
And will you raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your business address and your occupation or profession.
I'm the president of W.S. Cumbie Construction, located at 938 Lincoln Avenue in Springfield.
And you obviously know that we're here for conditional use approval as one of the conditions for obtaining a demolition permit. There are some other things we'll have to comply with as well, but you're aware of that.
Yes.
And directing your attention to Exhibit A3 in the exhibit packets. Is that a copy of the current deed for units 1 through 4 of the 110-112 condominium located at 110-112 Park Avenue?
Yes.
And are units 1 through 4 of the condominium owned by 110 Park Avenue LLC?
Yes, they are.
And is that a limited liability company?
Yes.
Are you one of the principals of 110 Park Avenue owner LLC?
Yes.
And who are the other principals?
The other principals are William Cumbie Jr., Don Delson, and Adam Cumbie.
Directing your attention to Exhibit A4, is that a copy of the current deed for Unit 5 in the 110-112 Park Avenue condominium?
Yes.
And Unit 5 is currently owned by 112 Park Avenue LP?
Yes.
And is that in partnership controlled by Donald Delson?
Yes.
Directing your attention to Exhibit A5, is that a copy of the agreement of sale and the addenda for the purchase of 102-104 Park Avenue, the other property involved in this application?
Yes.
And is the contract purchaser or buyer under that agreement of sale 110 Park Avenue LLC?
Yes, it is.
Now, the applicants applied for conditional use approval to permit the demolition of all of the buildings slash structures on the properties at 102-104 and 110-112 Park Avenue to make way for a proposed mixed-use commercial residential building. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in what zoning district are the properties?
The Town Center zoning district.
And that was created in 2013?
Correct.
Did the applicants receive a zoning permit for the proposed new building?
We have.
And directing your attention to Exhibit A6 in the exhibit packets, is that a copy of the zoning permit approval letter from the Borough Zoning Officer dated April 11, 2022?
Yes.
And how many buildings are proposed to be demolished to make way for the proposed development?
Four separate.
For which the zoning permit?
4 separate buildings are proposed.
Now, is Exhibit 7A a site plan which shows the 4 buildings which are proposed for demolition? And you could put this one up on the screen as well.
Yes.
May I interrupt a second? Is there any way we can have the screen? I know the audience needs to see it, but I think council needs to see it too. Is there any way to adjust the screen slightly? I know we have it in paper form, but it's kind of hard to see.
Maybe you can just turn it this way.
A little bit. That would be helpful. Thank you. That's good. It also made the music stop. Can the audience still see it? You can get up and move around if you want to. I know I have it, so I'm listening on the screen. Thank you. Yep. Yeah, there you go. That's it. Thank you.
Is that better?
Okay? Ready to proceed?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would you please point out the buildings proposed for demolition on Exhibit A7?
Sure. The first is 110 Park, that's shown in orange in the top right, as you see it on the plan. That has a footprint of approximately 2,750 square feet. The second is 102-104 Park. That has a footprint of approximately 3,800 square feet. It's shown in red here, so the top left portion of the plan.
The third is 112 Park. It's a footprint of approximately 1,500 square feet. It's shown in green on the bottom left of this plan. And the last is a garage structure with no specific address that is located behind, or on the bottom, as you see on the plan, behind 102, 104 Park. It has a footprint of approximately 600 square feet.
That's a small yellow building in the lower
Correct.
right.
Thank you.
Do you have photographs of the buildings which are proposed for demolition?
We do.
Please review those photographs. I believe they're exhibits A8 through A11 in the exhibit packets.
Sure. So first is the 110 Park Avenue structure, which you see here. Second is 102, 104 Park, shown here. Third, 112 Park Avenue. And fourth, the garage structure behind 102, 104 Park.
Great. And you are aware that the zoning ordinance requires conditional use approval for the demolition of any structures in the district?
Yes.
Of the 4 buildings to be demolished, how many of them are listed on the borough's Historic Resources Survey published in 2001 as amended? I don't think there have been any amendments, but the Historic Resources Survey.
Two buildings are 110 Park and 102, 104 Park.
And they are the buildings closest to Park Avenue on each of the parcels involved?
That's correct.
What about the other 2 buildings, the buildings to the rear of each property, the 112 Park Avenue that you just showed us, and the garages behind 102-104? Are they listed on the survey at all?
No, neither of those buildings are listed.
And did you and the other principals of the applicants review Chapter 1256 of the zoning ordinance, setting forth the applicable zoning regulations in the town center district, and attempt to address those regulations and follow the process set forth in the ordinance?
We did at long length. Summarized, the town center zoning district has 7 sections: a purpose section, a use section, 3 sections dealing with design, dimensional, and other standards for new structures, and then 2 sections that deal with processes: the conditional use process and the land development review process. The conditional use process that's outlined is the process we're here in front of you for to do. Beginning with the purpose section, there are a number of purposes listed, some of which are directly at odds with others, which is understandable. Any ordinance or any law will have trade-offs. What is clear is that the bulk of the ordinance that was passed deals with very specific dimensional and other design standards of new structures. 3 of the 7 sections address this directly. Regarding the building standards, etc., Mr. Petrosa has said it. The zoning permit process that we went through and the zoning permit that we were issued was a process whereby a determination was made that those design, dimensional, and other provisions of the code were met by the design for the building. That was a prerequisite to the process that we're here in front of you tonight, the conditional use process, to begin that process.
Now, have you reviewed section 1264.11, which are the general conditional use provisions of the ordinance?
Yes, we have. These apply not just to the town center, but
the board is, the council is certainly capable of reading that. I don't want you to read those, but those standards, when you look at them, do you believe that the proposed demolition of these buildings for the purpose indicated will violate any of those general standards? They're very general, sort of subjective standards, but do you believe it will violate any of those standards?
I do not believe it will violate any of those standards. It is a little confusing to think of demolition as a use, and many of the conditional use standards were clearly written to apply to conditional uses of new buildings and new uses of, or uses that are not fully contemplated by the zoning code in its direct letter. Here we have a situation where the new use is a by right use, but the demolition that leads to that new use is a conditional use. So it's a little bit confusing from that perspective, but we do believe that we meet all of the criteria necessary for the conditional use.
Now, are you aware that the ordinance provides that in order for a building listed in the borough's 2001 Historic Resources Survey to be demolished, it must be demonstrated that demolition of that building will not have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center?
Yes, we are.
And Do you believe the demolition of the building located at the front of 102-104 Park Avenue would have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center?
No, I do not believe the demolition of 102-104 Park would have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center.
Please explain why you feel that way.
Well, there's several reasons. First, there's a question trying to make this as objective as possible. There's a question of degree. We have a substantial word in there that we need to address. 102 and 104 has a footprint of approximately 3,800 square feet, and the street frontage that it occupies is roughly 4 linear feet of street frontage on Park Avenue.
Did you say 4 or 40?
40 linear feet. Both of those represent less than 1% of the footprint of the town center zoning district and less than 1% of the street frontage in the town center zoning district. Second, there's the subjective judgment of a negative impact on the character of the town. I'll point out that the character of the town center right now, there's a mix of architectural styles. It's eclectic, shall we say. And while the front facade of 102-104 Park is not the most unattractive facade in the town center, it does suffer from a lack of accessibility, the lack of to engage the population with the street level frontage. And given that the alley to the west of 102-104 Park is used as a somewhat public space, the western facade of 102-104 Park certainly does not add to the character of the town center.
Do you believe that the demolition of the building in the front of the property known as 110-112 Park Avenue, commonly known as 110 Park Avenue, would have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center?
I do not.
Why not?
The same arguments that I laid out for 102-104 Park certainly apply, given the substantial question and the size and scale of 110 Park. But the primary argument that I would put out is that it's not really part of the town center as it exists now. My understanding is that 110 Park is a converted duplex residential structure. It's now used as office space. It's set back over 40 feet from the street, separated by several steps and additional steps up to a porch. So again, it doesn't engage with the town center in the way that you would think of a building that engages with the public in the center of the town.
Now, was consideration given to preserving any portion of the building at 102-104 and somehow incorporating it into the proposed new building?
Yes.
And why isn't that proposed?
There are a few reasons, and I'll try to summarize as best I can. The major roadblocks that we encountered in looking at different ways of incorporating the existing structure into a new project. First, was structural. This is an old building. The footings and foundations of the existing building are adequate for its use, but to build anything around it or put any additional load on it would require extensive development beneath them. Second, there's the accessibility question I brought up. The current stores are not ADA accessible. To bring them into compliance without completely altering the facade of that proved completely impossible. Third, there's a question of zoning compliance. The existing building facade does not comply with the zoning code as written for new buildings. Now, granted, it is not a new building, but the zoning code for new buildings has very particular standards with respect to number of openings, percentage of openings relative to solid portions of the facade. And the existing structure at 102-104 Park would not come close to complying with those in any way. So in order to incorporate that facade into a larger facade that met all of those provisions in the code would end up with a very challenged situation to meet the requirements for the new structure without completely, with it being harmonious in any way with the existing facade of 102-104 Park.
Was there any way to incorporate the 110 building into the project?
No. 110, the setbacks from the front is the most relevant clause in the ordinance here. There's a minimum of 0 feet and a maximum of 5 feet. Clearly that was written into the code to design buildings that engage with the public, that sit on the property line, that are like the rest of the buildings you see on Park Avenue. 110 Park could not be incorporated into a project and solve any of those goals.
Are there any vacant parcels in the town center that would be available for development of a new building that would not require any demolition?
No, and I'll refer to, what exhibit? Sorry.
812.
Thank you. Exhibit 812, which is a graphic that we've put together that shows the town center zoning district. What you see in the green border as the borders of the town center zoning district as it was created in 2013. Red buildings, here are buildings that are on the Historic Resources Survey. Conditional use is required for demolition of any building in the town center. So even buildings that are not listed, like we touched on earlier, the garages behind 102, 104 Park, would need to go through a conditional use process to be demolished. But 102, 104, and 110 Park are on that list. They are highlighted here in purple. And then lastly, in blue, shows you the area of Borough Hall and the other publicly owned land. So you get a sense of the footprint of existing buildings, and there's nowhere in the town center zoning district that you can construct a building that complies with this code without demolition.
Even in 2013, when the town center district was created from the EA Business Apartment District, were there any vacant parcels where development of a new building could be erected without demolition?
No, to my knowledge, nothing has been constructed nor demolished in the town center since the ordinance was enacted.
I don't think you specifically covered this yet. I apologize if you did. Which parcels in the town center district do not have buildings included in the Historic Resources Survey on them?
Sure. Excuse me. There are five parcels in the town center zoning district that don't have a building that's listed on the Historic Resources list. There's 101 South Chester Road, that's the office building now owned by Swarthmore College. There are the condominiums on Rutgers Avenue to the east of the post office. There is the apartment building at, I think it's 116, or directly to the east of 110 Park. And then there is the round bank located sort of opposite the fire station. I'm not sure what street that address is on, to be honest.
And that's it?
That is it.
Okay.
There is one building that was, prior to the enactment of the town center zoning district, that was on the list that was created in 2001 that's since been demolished, and that's the old co-op building.
But that was before the requirement for the conditional use process for the demolition.
That is my understanding, yes.
Now, Exhibit 813, I don't think we need to go over it in detail. I just want to explain what it is and why it's in the packets. That is in tax parcel 9.
That is correct. So the numbers I just quoted in terms of tax parcels that have and do not have a building listed, you can refer to that exhibit for what, for which is which.
I think that's most of the questions I wanted to ask you, but I think I may. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think we touched on it. I do just want to state that we looked at the town center zoning district ordinance in great detail and attempted to design and approach the borough with something that was clearly contemplated by that ordinance when it was enacted. We understand that conditional use for demolition is part of that process, and that's why we're here. But I want to stress that we're not trying to put the cart before the horse. We are following the process that was outlined in that ordinance. We submitted for a zoning permit. We were granted that zoning permit, and this is the next step in the process.
That's all the questions I have.
Okay, I'm going to, well, parties go in the order they were recognized. So, McGowan, if you have any questions.
Thank you for this, Scott. Good evening, Mr. Tunde. I'll be pretty quick with this. I want to draw your attention back to section 1256.06 of the zoning code that we testified as to. It's really the reason we're here today. 1256.06, the second subpart reads, demolition of the building will not have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center. You testified that when you evaluated the first portion of that substantial, you used
I quoted two numbers. The first is the footprint, square footage. The second is the linear feet of facade.
So, in that clause, substantial negative effect is on the character of the town center, correct? As agreed. What did you use to evaluate character of the town center in relation to square footage and frontage?
The square footage and frontage is clearly an argument towards the word substantial, right? It's not, there's an impact to the character. Is it one question? The second question is it substantial? So those numbers are addressing substantial. My personal opinion is that it is not, regardless, it would not have a negative impact on the character of the town.
Understand? Is it located anywhere in the zoning code that substantial is meant to refer to front lineage or square footage of the property, of the building?
No, it's a subjective term.
Thank you, that's all I have for now.
Okay, Mr. Richardson, do you have any questions for the witness?
Sorry, I'm not a lawyer.
What I mean?
So I was actually going to reference this point just now. We were actually talking about forever changing two lots by taking those buildings down. The lots themselves are a much bigger part of the town than you just indicated.
So the question of, give some latitude, but this is for questions.
I could turn that into a question, but I think you
Yeah,
get the
so,
point. Okay.
let me give a little, just for the parties that aren't represented by lawyers. You'll have a chance to make your own cases, make your own arguments. Your cross-examination is generally a chance to ask them about what they said. So if you can't make a question, that would be helpful.
I will move on to the next and hope I can do a better job.
That's okay.
Okay. I'm glad you still have this slide up because I do have a question on, I think you said 110 Park is not part of town center somehow because of the setback or something. I didn't quite understand that.
So my comment was that the current use, the current structure of 110 Park does not engage with the town center in the way you would expect when you hear that term. It's not a statement that it's not within the ordinance as drawn.
Okay, so if I disagree with that, that's not my time to do that now, right?
Yeah, you'll have a chance.
All right, okay, I think I'm out of my head, so I'll just.
No, actually,
There's an integrity.
your question made your point, and that's all.
Okay.
So
Thank you very much.
And I don't want to discourage the parties from asking questions, and so feel free. Ms. Ellis, do you have any questions for us? Ms. Down? We've met with you.
I just want to know what the definition of character is.
But this is your chance to ask them.
What would you define it as per the ordinance? And what is it all very subjective, like we're talking about substantial and we're talking about character, like an impact on the character. So I'm a bit confused about what that is.
I think right now what you're trying to do is just if you have any questions related to the testimony that was just given by this witness, you can ask him questions about that.
Oh, okay. So what did you mean by, what's your definition of character? Because you talk about substantial part, but the character of the community.
So with respect to, we're talking about buildings. So the character would be architectural in nature, and there's a large mix of architectural styles. So that is what I interpreted it to mean. I didn't write that provision. I'm doing my best to interpret it in the spirit of the town center zoning ordinance that was passed in its entirety. So that's the best answer I can give.
Okay, so I reserve for public comments to talk more about buildings.
You'll have a chance before public comment, because you've been recognized as a party to make whatever arguments you want to make. And if you have examples or evidence or photographs that you want to present, you'll be able to do that.
I've got nothing. No, I just wanted to know what the definition of character was for the ordinance as the legal counsel for Borough Council. How do you define that?
Well, I don't know that the ordinance defines the word character, which means the council people don't have to draw on their knowledge of what that means.
Okay, all right. Thank you. That helps.
Mr. Federico, do you have any questions?
No questions, sir.
Okay. Mr. Petrosa, do you want to?
Next witness?
Yes.
Yes, Susanna?
Sir?
Callis.
I thought of a way to ask a question about a point. May I come up with a second try?
Could you come up, please? I can't hear you.
Okay.
This is general curiosity. So I'm back to 110 Park. In what respect do you feel that nicely landscaped green space in front of a building prevents people from engaging with that building?
I would say the use of the building and its separation from the sidewalk. When you think of the town center, you don't necessarily think of green space between the sidewalk and building uses. It's not to say we're anti-green space, it's just that's my interpretation of town center and engagement with public spaces, which would be the sidewalk. It's the public space in front of my park.
Thank you.
Next witness is Susanna Ward.
Ms. Ellis, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to just get super duper clarity here in terms of the character, your definition of it again, because we were going around, a bunch of people were answering that, so could you just clearly state what's meant by that from your perspective as a developer?
So here's how I'll answer that question. As a developer, we're looking at the town center zoning ordinance. We're trying, there are many words in that are not defined, as Mr. Scott referenced. There are many terms that are defined. They're laid out in a specific section. Character is not. So we tried to interpret it in the context of the entire ordinance, which clearly contemplates through 3 of its 7 sections, standards for new buildings. And in that context, we feel that demolition clearly is contemplated in the ordinance, and that clause was there to address the situation where landmark structures or a vast swath of the town center was proposed to be demolished. So that's how we interpret it. Character can mean many things, but we try to interpret it as in the context of the words that are around it in the entirety of the ordinance.
I will just state for the record that that's not really clear to me, so.
Charles, you want to proceed?
Yes, Susanna Ward Callis.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Walsh just reminded me it's now council's turn.
Oh, if they have questions. Do any council members have questions for this witness? You do? You don't have to.
No, I don't.
Now's your time.
I kind of have a question. Not I kind of have a question, I have a question. And it's an interpretation question. So are you saying that substantial and character are measurable in numbers?
No, they're both subjective terms. What I am trying to do is provide as much context around both of them as possible, because subjective terms like that are 100% dependent on their context.
Have you, go ahead.
No, please.
Have you in other contexts had to make these assessments, and if you have, can you share?
No, I have not made cannot say I've made a similar assessment that I can draw on as a relevant example.
Do you live in Swarthmore?
I do not.
Are there any other questions from council or the mayor?
Bill, can you talk about the way that the activities of the current buildings, what do you know about the activities of the buildings in their previous or their current uses?
Sure. So clearly the two retail spaces at 102 and 104 Park have been well occupied for a while. The garden in front, apartment to the east, 102, 104, I know has a Christmas celebration and other things that are significant. And I know that 110 Park has had, generally been partially occupied for a long period of time. It's been in office use for quite a while. To my knowledge, a converted duplex. If you walk through the space, it looks like a converted duplex. That's my knowledge of the history, the recent use of those buildings.
And does anybody live in any of those buildings, or did anyone live in those buildings before the sale?
There are a couple apartments that are on the second story of 102, 104 Park. We are the equitable owners of that building right now, so we are not the direct owners. So I do not know if there are still tenants in those spaces right now. There were.
And so what will happen to the people who live there if this conditional use is approved?
They would need to find living arrangements elsewhere.
So this conditional use would displace the residents who live there now?
If there are any residents that live there now, it would. Correct.
Mr. Cummings, you can't do that. If you get called as a witness, it's okay. Francie, question?
Okay, thank you. Are you an architect as well, Mr. Cummings?
I am not an architect.
I don't know if this is a developer question as well as an architect question, but with design standards for usefulness in a town center area, is there any difference, say, in an urban area like Philadelphia as compared to a town center in a village the size of Swarthmore in design standards?
So,
With setbacks, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that.
Specific to setbacks?
Specific to setbacks.
Sure. So there are a few setbacks in the code. The one that I mentioned is the one at ground level, which is 0 to 5 feet. That would be common in town centers and as well as bigger cities. That's what you commonly see when you walk down any block in Philadelphia. You see buildings up to the sidewalk line. In addition to that, there are other setback requirements in the code, which have to do with the perceived scale of the building at pedestrian level. So there's a setback at a specific height that's also required in the code. So when I speak to that, what I'm speaking to is what was drafted in this ordinance, not necessarily my opinion. Those are things that are laid out very specifically. We do have other witnesses that can attest to the meanings of some of those things, but I do want to stress that what I'm trying to say here is my interpretation of the code, not my idea for what is appropriate.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions from council?
I do. Someone else should go, but I do have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
Sarah, did you?
Jill, go ahead and finish.
This is a really, it's very subjective, right? So we're all looking at language that's extremely subjective, but you're basing your assessment as the expert here, I assume, on something. So are you able to give us an example of what a scenario where demolition would have a substantial negative impact? Because I'm assuming that you've gone through that analysis and you put this in this category, and there's another category.
I can, and I know that other witnesses who have much more background in this with regard to these issues will go into this as well. But clearly the town center of Swarthmore has an anchor corner. It has some buildings that are not just historic or of a significant age, but also have a very specific character. Those are the things that I would think would come into play when you think about substantial negative impact on the character. There are a mentioned different architectural styles, so it's hard to say that the character is this particular style. But certainly there are landmark structures in the borough that I would 100% agree would have a substantial negative impact on the character of the town center. I think there's a reason why that clause is in the ordinance.
Thank you. So you mentioned one of the ways in which you're judging that answer to that question was lack of accessibility for, I believe, 102, 104 Park. Is there a way that you could remodel all of the buildings to make them accessible? Is that within your ability to do without demolishing the buildings?
It is. The question was the facade, right? There's some stairs leading up to the retail spaces. So in order to make them accessible, you need to make them accessible somewhere off the front facade or drastically alter the front facade. So it's not a question, it's not a question of course it's possible to make the spaces accessible as they exist today. What we couldn't do was do it without impacting that front facade. The only way to do it would be to force an accessible point somewhere else in the building, which has a domino effect on a lot of other factors.
Bill, as follow-up to what I was asking you before, is it your position that if there is no negative substantial impact on Swarthmore, not to have the activity of the charitable Christmas festivities that Dave Augustine put on for many years on that site?
I wanted to make one clarification. The ordinance speaks to demolition of buildings. It doesn't talk about use of open space. So it's strictly speaking the demolition of the building itself.
My assumption is that those lights are plugged into that building.
I don't think having electricity coming from that building relates to demolition of the building itself. You could put, you could get any other source of electricity. But the issue is very narrowly, does the demolition of the structure of the building have a substantial negative effect? That's what the ordinance says.
So you will answer.
I'm just saying that that's not relevant to the issue before the Borough Council, but if you would like, if you can answer it.
No, that's okay. Let's talk about what happened in the building. So, Bill, is it your position that there is no negative, substantial impact on the community to displace the commercial residents in that building?
So the verbiage is a substantial negative impact on the character of the town center. So that is my statement, that it will not have a substantial negative impact on the character of the town center. That is what the ordinance says.
To displace the commercial residents who are using the current building for this.
They agree.
Right.
You're aware that commercial tenants have signed a lease for different space. They're moving anyhow.
I am.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm concerned about the impact on those buildings and those businesses' viability moving forward. It's a big cost to a small business, but I'm actually most concerned about the people who live there. And so is it your position, last time around, is it your position that there is no negative substantial impact on the town center, that people are going to have to move away and not going to have a place to live anymore?
If you look at the number of residential units that are in the town center, it's not a substantial impact. It would be wonderful if we could build it without displacing anyone. But unfortunately, we can't. But it is my position it's not a substantial negative impact. It's, I believe 6 units, and there's, it's been a long time since I did this math, but I think it's about 3% or so of the, if you look at the Swarthmore, the Greylock, buildings, and the apartments in the Shrine, the Shacker building, etc. This is not a substantial impact. I wish it was 0, but my statement is that it's not a substantial impact.
But it's 100% of the apartment that that person lives in, right?
Yes.
That's all.
Are there any other questions to this witness?
We'll follow up to the conversation just now. One of his answers.
Sure. Come up, please.
I'm not a jack in the box, I promise. I'm sorry. Just a question, are you aware that Shannon's shop is in fact accessible through the side door? She has a wheelchair ramp on her side door.
I was not.
Okay.
Okay, with that, your next witness, please.
Susanna Morikawa.
Please state your full name, please.
My name is Susanna Morikawa. I live at 609 Ogden Avenue in Swarthmore.
And will you raise your right hand, please? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you.
May I proceed?
Yes.
Please.
Susanna, what is your occupation or profession?
I'm an archivist. I work for Swarthmore College and Friends Historical Library.
And what is an archivist?
An archivist organizes and prepares records and personal papers for preservation. We also make the inventories available so that they're accessible to a broader public.
Do you have an interest and background in history and in particular in Demolition?
Yes. My background is I have an MFA and then I have a PhD in humanities with a concentration in art history. I worked on the Bicentennial Catalog in Philadelphia, and I worked in the Pennsylvania Academy and Independence Hall on their portrait museum. When I moved out to Lansdowne, which is where I'm from, I concentrated on local history, which was always an interest, and on architectural history. So I was involved there with the Lansdowne Cultural Alliance and also the Greater Gladstone Civic Association.
When did you move to Swarthmore?
Well, I moved in 1986, but I first should say in Lansdowne, I got involved with the local history. The Greater Gladstone Civic Association was working with, interested in having Lansdowne be on the site survey that the state of Pennsylvania was working on, and I volunteered to work on that. And my work was the basis for the first site survey, and actually I participated in the preparation of the National Historic District application that was accepted in one section of the town.
And then how about when you moved to Swarthmore? When was that?
I moved here in 1986.
And did you serve on the planning commissions?
I did, yeah, early on I did, and I served on a number of other organizations, including community center and school, whatever.
What, if any, involvement have you had with the Swarthmore Historical Society?
When I moved to Swarthmore, the community was planning for the centennial celebration, so I quickly got involved in that. It was a number of projects that were planned, and there was a group of us who were interested in creating a historical society that would preserve the history of the borough, since there was no resource like that. So the Historical Society was created in 1988 and incorporated in 1989.
Were you one of the founders?
Yes, I was one of the first board members beside the incorporation.
And did you continue to serve on the
Yes.
Historical Society for some time?
Oh, yeah. We ran house tours and offered seminars and continued. I have worked informally as the archivist for the Historical Society, so I know the records very well.
What, if any, involvement with the Swarthmore Borough Historic Resources Survey published in 2001 did you have?
As a committee of the Historical Society, with my expertise and experience, I quickly volunteered to
chair the committee for the site survey. And I had worked in Lansdowne previously with people from Delaware County Planning, so I was familiar with the format and the people, and so we started working on that project.
Did you write and contribute the introductory essays for the sections of the published Swarthmore Historic Resources Survey?
I did because I had, working at the Friends Historical Library was where, until we created the Historical Society, that is where the bulk of historical information was and actually still is, because the founding of the borough was intertwined, well, really followed the founding of the college. So I had access to the resources and experience with the survey, and had done articles and whatever. So I knew the borough very well.
Now, have you written one or more histories of the borough of Swarthmore?
Yes, when we, beside informal pieces, when we did another project of the centennial was an exhibition of the history of Swarthmore. And my colleague Patricia O'Donnell and I put together an exhibition at Swarthmore College. And at the end of that, we were urged to put it into publication to preserve the information. Sometime after that, we were also approached by Arcadia Press to put together a history of Swarthmore for their series, Images of America, and that was published, Borough of Swarthmore, in 2009.
All right. And were you one of two people specifically acknowledged by the Delaware County Planning Department at the beginning of the Historic Resources Survey, which was the Swarthmore Borough, which was published in 2001?
Yes, I was, and Mary Ann Jevons, who was the first president of the Historical Society, was the other person.
And how long did you work on the Historic Resources Survey?
We started in, I guess, 1989, and it was published in 2001.
Now, did you take the photograph of the front facade of the building in front of 110 and 112 Park Avenue, which appears in the Historic Resources Survey?
Yes.
And do you have your own personal copy of the Historic Resources Survey?
Yes. When the survey was published, I was given a copy, and copies were given to the borough manager, facilities at Swarthmore College, Public Library, Friends Historical Library, where it's on reference, and also to members of planning at the time. I don't know where some of those copies had gotten to, but there were a number of copies that were distributed.
What was the purpose of the Historic Resources Survey in the Borough of Swarthmore?
The simplest definition that we would give to people is it was a state-mandated effort to record structures that are older than 50 years. Of course, it's more complicated than that, and the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission has laid out the purposes and goals. All of that is available online if you go to their website, but basically they say it's intended to compile descriptions and information about the history of the community and its built environment. It's meant to serve as a history resource and as a tool for preservation and planning.
Now, who was able to submit a particular building and information about that building to be included in the survey?
Anyone. And still are. It's an ongoing. It's not anybody has access to the forms which are now online to contribute to those.
And how did someone submit information about a building for the Historic Resources Survey back then?
The way we worked at the time, since it was a centennial, our first focus was to do the oldest buildings up to 1893. And after that, we moved on, and I say volunteers who were solicited to submit information, and we moved on to architect design properties and any place that there was a history that people wanted to contribute.
Now, would submitting the form automatically include a building in the Historic Resources Survey?
Absolutely. The ones that are published, I think only 350 are published, but if you go through the whole survey, you'll see that some sections actually include a number of properties.
And were many of the buildings included in the, I'll just refer to it as the survey, meaning the Historic Resources Survey, were many of the buildings either on the Swarthmore College campus or residential structures?
Yes. Well, no, that's okay. I was going to say the borough was developed as a series of tracts. So there are residential areas plus the campus. So that's the way it was pretty much divided.
Now, did being included in the Historic Resources Survey necessarily mean that the building had historic significance, making it worthy of historic protection and preservation?
Historic means older than 50 years. Significance, as we keep batting around, is not only it's significance. If you're applying for a national register, it would mean important to the history, important architect, important stylistically, but it's not. That is for a national register application, and of course the site survey is just a record. It's not, it has no protection. It's not regulatory. It's collecting information.
Now, directing your attention to, I have marked Exhibit A14 for purposes of identification, which are excerpts from the Swarthmore Historic Resources Survey. Can you identify what A14 is? Is that for 110, 112 Park Avenue?
Yes.
And just, you don't have to go into great detail. What do you use of the pages?
The first page is and it has an actual term. The explaining the survey, what they call it. It's the basic information of the location, the address, the number assigned to the specific property, and a photograph.
How about the next page?
The next page is the historic narrative. It also gives the tax parcel code, and it gives a historic name if there was one, and then it gives a physical description.
What's the physical description for this?
Just basic,
Well, okay, you're right. It speaks for itself.
It's a two-story, 5-4 Victorian stucco twin building. It was constructed after 1910. We don't know anything much about it. Nobody's done a great deal, any research really on it. As I say, this was volunteer, so people had to supply information.
And what are the third and fourth pages?
That is the data sheet that the process was the people doing the actual field work filled out a form that was provided by the state and county. That form was given to Delaware County Planning Department, and they fed it into their database, and that's what this is.
Was this building eligible for the national register?
No.
And there's an evaluation section on here, on the last page, that says NR potential.
No, it's not a national register, and it is not, yeah.
Now, directing your attention to the 5 pages of the marked Exhibit 815 for purposes of identification. Is that the excerpt from the Historic Resources Survey, which includes 102-104 Park Avenue?
Yes.
And again, could you just run through that, what you just like to do?
This is rather interesting to me because it's an example of how more than one property was combined with under a single survey. This is the surveys for 110 to 104 and 100. All of them are included in that.
100 is the dry cleaner is?
It's Paulson's.
Paulson's, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Paulson's. So it gives the same information. It gives the code that was assigned to it. It gives a map of the location and a photograph.
And the photograph that's shown here is of 102-104.
Right. And then there were additional photographs added that gave other, and I don't think that's on here, other views of it. building.
And what about just the physical description or the narrative section?
That mostly covers Paulson's because, I'm looking one at you, one at the door. Okay. It's same thing. It gives it there's two-story brick and masonry building, detail of that, and they note the facade is the architectural element that is interesting. The rest of the building is unadorned and whatever.
Do you know when that building was built?
The estimate was after 1909. Now we know it's about 1929 with further research.
And also, you have the date sheets on Unit 815 as well for the 102, 104 Park Avenue.
Yes.
And does that indicate the same thing on the last page of the date sheet, not being 15?
Yes. Yes.
Now, do you think that the demolition of 102, 104 Park Avenue to allow redevelopment for a building which has received a zoning permit would have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center?
This is opinion again. There are no definitions of character, and there's none in the site survey. There's none actually if you go to the Historical and Museum Commission. It's subjective. If you want my opinion, I do not think it will.
And why do you say that?
These buildings are on the periphery of the main retail area. They don't connect with the apartment next door, nor with the other retail particularly. The whole business district is very eclectic, which is why it was hard to, when you say character, I think it's something that we struggle with. There are the iconic buildings on the corner, Michael's Corner, Shire Building, the bank, but you know, many of the buildings are, you know, workable vernacular business buildings.
And what about, the first question I believe was referred to 102-104, my previous question. With respect to 110 Park Avenue, do you think that demolition of 110 Park Avenue to allow redevelopment for a building which the zoning officers found to be in compliance with the ordinance would have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center?
Again, it's my opinion that it does not.
And in your opinion, do the buildings on 102-104 and 110-112 Park Avenue have historic significance?
Again, they're historic because they're older than 50 years. They're not significant in themselves to deserve special preservation. And of course, Swarthmore doesn't have any preservation ordinance per se. Again, as I said before, the site survey is not regulatory. It doesn't offer protection. So it's a matter of Swarthmore does not have any protective ordinances that, and either if they were registered on National Register, the thing to always remember is that also doesn't give you protection. But they're not. They're not even in the category to be National Register.
There were a few buildings in the borough that were eligible for protection.
Yes, and eligible doesn't mean that they necessarily would be approved for a National Register. It means they're eligible to make application. And that includes Michael's Corner, Shire Building, and some of the other buildings.
Now, has the Historic Resources Survey actually been updated since 2008?
It hasn't been, this is the only published form, because it's a public record. Some of the information was taken into the Athenaeum database that's available online at Philadelphia Architects, but there hasn't been a second survey done.
Was the Historic Resources Study submitted to and logged into the State Bureau of Historic Preservation?
Yes, it was fed into their template. The instructions are, and they still have a very similar template that you fill out, and that is filed with the state.
Before that information was logged into the state, the information from the Swarthmore Historic Resources Survey, does the state do any independent investigation of that?
No,
No, it's the county. You work, for the state of Pennsylvania, they work at the county level. And at our county, Delaware County, they sought to work with volunteers where they could, other groups or whatever.
I think that's all the questions I have.
Okay, Mr. McGowan?
Good evening, Ms. Morikawa. Real quick, I believe you testified that old is 50 or 50 years old. What did you specifically? Where does that come from?
The guidelines.
The guidelines,
Yeah.
and you mentioned that.
From the state.
Right.
Commonwealth, I should say.
And you mentioned that anyone could submit
Yes, absolutely.
these forms.
Yeah. It's actually online now, which, although they're in the process of updating their website, I think. I went on about 2 weeks ago and they are offered. I don't know if it works, but you can actually apply online.
Understood. You testified that there's no preservation ordinance in Swarthmore Borough.
That's right.
Wouldn't you agree with me that we're here tonight on a preservation ordinance?
That's because the zoning, rather than if you look at the site survey, there were recommendations from the county, and some of the recommendations they made were to look into Act 167 for a local historic district, or different ordinances. What they opted to do was use the town center in that case and refer back to the historic site survey for discussion probably, which is what it does, but it doesn't either one. And of course the site survey doesn't supersede local regulations or ordinances.
But,
so it goes kind of in a circle.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But the zoning ordinance does provide specific these criteria.
But they're not specific. No, I mean, they don't define character, they don't define any of those terms.
I actually do have Exhibit A6 available to you. I wanted to bring that up real quick. It's the April 11th. It's the zoning permit letter. So you testified that the ordinance doesn't define historic value, correct?
Right.
I want to draw your attention to the second paragraph of this letter. It's the third line down, and the sentence beginning with "since." Can you read that into the record, please?
Since the buildings are considered to have historic value, but that's kind of not correct. It's actually, they are included in the site survey. I think it's a misinterpretation of using a nebulous term like value, because there is no such definition.
I understand that, but that's the zoning officer of the borough making that.
Right.
And this is a zoning ordinance that contains these criteria.
That's fine. I mean, I'm not involved in zoning.
I understand. I have no more questions. Thank you.
So, Mr. Richardson, please.
I'll try to do better. I have two questions. I'm confused, and even after the last lawyer, even more so. At the very end of your testimony, you indicated that the Historic Resources Survey was fixed some time ago. Is that correct?
That it was what?
That was published some time ago and is somewhat static?
No,
Is that correct?
no, it's not static. Was published once in 2001, but it's not static at all. It's ongoing.
Okay, so the question is, could I tomorrow have my building entered into that survey?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'll tell you how if you want detail.
No, I'm just shocked.
I'd love it.
Okay, the second question has to do with your opinion that the demolition of these buildings would not have significant negative impact on the character of town center, and you reference that they're being on the periphery, and I wonder to what extent you consider that they are actually not at all on the periphery of the social heart of the town center, the farmers market, the amphitheater, and and other activities like that.
Oh, you mean activities, or what are you speaking of? I mean, it's across
The
the
character of
street.
town center, it seems to me, has to do. To what extent did you consider, in your opinion, when you stated that these buildings are on the edge of town center, that a key component of the character of town center is the activities that occur there, and that they are central to them? They're directly across the street from the farmer's market and the amphitheater.
Yeah, I was talking about the built environment and the architecture. Obviously, across the street, the Borough Hall is there,
Yes.
and the library. So
Yep.
we have a real mix of buildings in
Thank you.
the center.
Ms. Ellis? Questions? Ms. Dow? Ms. Dow, I can't see it. Are you? Okay, I'm sorry, I just can't see it from where I'm sitting, so.
So, to sort of follow on what he was saying, the fact you kind of separate these two buildings from the rest of the downtown center is confusing to me. And historic values, which are over, kind of plain and simple, I think. So it really does come down to just somebody's opinion of what he feels contributes to the character of a town. Correct? Is that what you're saying here?
There are no specific guidelines for what, yeah, I mean, it is subjective, because what's the character, I mean, you can get philosophically into what is the character of the downtown, and it was just mentioned, it includes all those activities.
Exactly.
So it's not just a matter of buildings.
Yes, and there's a lot of history.
Yeah.
It's different stores and they've been there,
Right,
and used
right.
by many people, et cetera, so that contributes to character.
That's, yeah, right.
Okay, but in your opinion, you don't feel they contributed to the character of this community?
No, I don't think they're essential. I mean, I think a lot of these terms are the essential to the town, the character, and I don't think they're essential.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Federico?
Ms. Morcombe, you had expressed an opinion, I believe, that Swarthmore Borough has not enacted an historic preservation ordinance.
Yes.
You're familiar with what a historic preservation ordinance would look like?
Yes. Yeah.
What would you typically expect to see in a formal historic preservation ordinance?
This is just the first step. In other words, the survey, the first step is a survey, but then you have to go into much more detail and have specifics about what is and what's not part of the, for instance, district. And then you would have to have specific guidelines and regulations. I mean, it's an ordinance, it's not just... I should mention, years ago I was part of the task force that looked into different options for the borough of Swarthmore. And what the consensus was from council at the time was they wanted advisory sort of guidelines, an architectural advisory board, those things rather than regulatory ordinance.
So the one section in the town center ordinance would not, in your opinion, meet the standard of an ordinance intended to actually accomplish what a historic
No, because it
preservation?
has, right, exactly. It has contradictory things. It's not saying every building must be preserved. It also, it says keep that in account, but revitalization.
It did not explicitly set up criteria.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Is there another? Oh. Can you come out? I can't hear you. Can you just come out?
I just wanted to ask a procedural question. If somebody wanted to become a party still, is it past the time for them to do that?
Well,
They're just asking
not
procedural.
necessarily.
Okay.
I mean, so, but.
for Dr. Mark Allen. Yes.
Susanna, how many buildings, both commercial and residential, were included in the historic resource survey?
Over 350, which is why after 10 years, they said, you know, we have to produce something. It's the largest survey in Delaware County, and again, it includes multiple structures, as you see, even for these ones that we looked at tonight.
So if we assume that inclusion in the survey provided some kind of implicit preservation or protection, all 300 would have to...
350 plus, yeah.
Okay. Did the Plan Commission, when they developed the existing ordinance, have access to this survey?
Yes, the survey came out in 2001, and I think the ordinance is 2013, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So they could have added language in the ordinance that specifically granted preservation or protection status to
Yes.
buildings in the town center. They didn't do that.
No.
Do you know why they didn't do that?
No, I wasn't part of it.
Okay, but the fact is that our ordinance has no protective
No.
status, and yet they were in possession of the historic resource survey, so they had the information necessary.
Because the survey doesn't, there is no definition of character as we're arguing right here. You know, things like that are kind of subjective.
Oh, thank you.
Any other questions from council?
I have a couple questions. Hi. I'm interested in your interpretation of the ordinance. Character, you really clarify this, I just want to make sure I understand. You're defining character as built-in life versus some
That's
social
right.
piece. Okay.
Right.
I just wanted to
Yes.
clear that up. I wanted to ask you about, were you involved in the walking tour?
Yes.
Map? of
Yes, I
Swarthmore?
actually, yeah, I did the works for that as well.
I read about that in the archives.
Yeah, and it is, yeah, it's available online through the borough site.
Yes, yes. Is the, I'm going to just call it the Celia Building. Is the Celia Building on that?
No, it's just, the discussion is the borough center, mostly focusing, I haven't even looked at it for a couple of years, on Michael's Corner, I believe.
Right, I noticed that as well. Do you know why? And is Michael's Corner the only historic building that's listed on the walking tour?
No, in the downtown?
Yeah,
We
the
only
downtown.
picked out, I forget how many there are. I think there are copies of the walking tour in Borough Hall to look, and we had to select, and it was the task force and members of the Historical Society that picked just the location where to make it, usable walking tour, where you could start, where you could go consecutively.
Should we make anything of the fact that a certain building was or was not selected to be put on that
No.
map?
Not extremely. I mean, you have, I think Parish Hall is on there in the campus, but there are certainly other buildings. The Quaker Meeting probably is. It's representative, I think, of a couple of residences, and the college, the president's house is on there. So it's a walking tour representative of the whole. And I should add that was the recommendation that came out of the task force, is to apply for National Register status for the whole borough of Swarthmore. Because it's really trying to divide it. We had a lot of different districts because Swarthmore was developed, the West Hill district, there was Gillespie tract, there were all these tracts that in themselves could be historic districts. So it kind of made sense to say, okay, let's make the whole town. And we did start to do a database of all the structures in Swarthmore. That was ambitious.
And I'm just curious, the buildings we're talking about here were not eligible for historic preservation, national historic preservation status.
Individually, there are a few. There's a list too of buildings that they recommend. Right now, the Benjamin West House is on it. And the house on Cedar Lane, the address that I always forget. And they had other ones to recommend that could be, particularly on the college campus.
I was referring to the buildings that we're talking about with regard to this.
Oh, no, these two buildings were not.
And can you say anything about that? Why? Is there a certain judgment that was made? Was it presented?
No, it wasn't even proposed because they're not, I mean, they don't, you have to be on the register, and you're talking again, if it's register, it's only acknowledgement of importance. And those buildings had really, I mean, every building has a history, but there's nothing that was really intertwined with the history of Swarthmore. I mean, except that everybody, whoever lived here was. Or architecturally, that's totally unique. So, you know, it wasn't even suggested. Nobody suggested at the time. And the county, when it's made its recommendations, didn't pick those buildings out.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question. Are there any buildings in the borough right now on the National Historic Register?
Yeah, that's what the Benjamin West House is on the campus, and that building on Cedar Lane is on there. There are some that are counted as eligible, meaning that somebody could make an application for them. And also, well, yeah, you know, again.
And I think you testified that even if a building had national registry status, that it remains unprotected. Can you explain what you meant by that?
That's, National Register acknowledges significance, but it doesn't protect unless federal money is being used. Then there's some protection.
Thank you. Questions from council?
Suzanne, can a municipality create an ordinance that provided such protection?
Yes, I mean, and that again, the purpose of the site survey really was to give information for the history of the town so people appreciate the community, but also to give information for planning. And that's where it comes into what sort of municipal planning every community wants.
So the opportunity for a municipality to provide protection is there.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure. Ms. Dow, come on back up.
Other people speak? Not yet.
They are not.
Only the parties tonight. Okay, so please go ahead, Ms. Dow.
So basically what I'm saying is that historic buildings are 50 years or older, correct?
Yes.
Say yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. So it's already been established that these two buildings are not on any list, they're not protected. So it comes back to character. And what's the difference from history? To me, history is not just how old the building is, but what's been there, what's contributed to the community, just walking, and history, character, which to me is aesthetics. It feels like what's been there before. I've lived here pretty much since 1971. And so is my mother. And we've seen changes and stuff, and there's history, these things, not just by age, but by what has been there, and what has happened there. And I'm having to go time with this, so that we're finding all these little details, and I'm not sure why these details are being gone over, because it's sort of a moot point, I think, that we know that these buildings are not protected, so why are we going into such detail about that? I'm just focusing on that this is very subjective, both history and the character of our community. Sorry, I guess that wasn't a question. Sorry about that. Question mark?
Well done. No more from council? No, sir, I'm sorry you can't. No, you're not a party, because we're having.
Are they?
They are parties.
Yeah, they are.
Perhaps you arrived late, but we recognize certain people who are parties. They are the ones who are allowed to ask questions tonight. People who are not parties will be able to ask when all the witnesses are done their testimony. And all the parties have presented their cases.
How are they a party?
Because they live within a certain proximity. They requested party status. They live within proximity that gives them an interest that is different than that of the general public. And that's what we're doing tonight. Well, it is, public comment can be questioned, and not under any obligation to answer, but they can answer questions.
What if these witnesses are here by the back bucket?
Are you planning to have your witnesses to the end?
Tonight,
And at the next hearing?
depends on when it is, and what the availability is. I think you said.
Tuesday and Wednesday of next week.
I haven't had a chance to talk to the witnesses to see who's available for the witnesses. But we'll try to get people who are kind of.
Okay. Next witness.
Yes, Laura Meminger.
I think just put. Yes.
Laura, please state your name and address.
My name is Laura Manager. I live at
I'm sorry, should be sworn in also. But go ahead, say your name and address.
400 North Swarthmore Avenue in Swarthmore.
Will you raise your right hand, please? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you.
Let me ask one question for you first.
Yes.
Was Susanna sworn in? She was.
She was.
Thank you. Okay.
Could I just remind everybody to speak into their microphones?
Yes.
Because I think the computer is struggling a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
Laura, by whom are you employed?
I am employed by Urban Partners. We are an economic development consulting firm. We work with planners and architects and work to revitalize urban and suburban areas through development and revitalization, rehabilitation projects.
And were you involved in the town revitalization strategy? I think it's the 1999.
I was. A lot of people in the community refer to that as the Jim Hartling strategy, which gets my goat, but it was the Jim Hartling Laura Manager strategy. Urban Partners was the prime consultant on that. We were assisted by a firm, a physical planning firm called Kai's Club.
And what was the purpose of the revitalization strategy?
It was to establish the framework for identifying, determining the feasibility, evaluating, and then building consensus for a variety of programmatic, policy, and development projects for the town center area in Swarthmore.
When you were doing that work for urban planners on the revitalization strategy, were you a resident?
I was not, no. Just a little aside, I was pregnant with my first child at the time, and for those of you with long memories, he was my first child. I was pregnant, I left, came back as the plan was wrapping up, and he's graduating from college next week. So time flies.
Was it in fact your work on the revitalization strategy that interested you in living in the borough?
It absolutely was. I was charmed by the place, and my husband and I were living in a little farmhouse outside of Upper Providence, and Putty Willetts knocked on my door with a casserole and a mobile from T-Bumbles. I got so many cards, casseroles, gifts. People were just wonderful. And when we wanted a community after our second child was born with more of a neighborhood feel and sidewalks and good schools, this is where I dragged my husband.
Have you served on the Swarthmore Borough Planning Commission?
I have. A few years after we moved to town, I got a call from a member of the Borough Council who was the planning and zoning liaison at the time, and there had been a planning commissioner, or someone in the planning commission, I don't remember who it was, but who had just started their second term and unexpectedly left town. So I filled out the remainder of that term. I think it started about 2007, 2008. and then a whole second term, and I left the Planning Commission at the end of 2014.
During your tenure on the Planning Commission, did the issue of whether to create a historic district in the town center come before the Planning Commission?
Yes, it did.
And what was was the 2001 Historic Resources Survey discussed at the Planning Commission meetings on whether to create a historic district in the town center?
It was. We had access to the survey. I wasn't one of the fortunate few who got my copy. But it definitely was, and it was a really challenging assignment because Borough Council had tasked us, based on the findings of the revitalization strategy, the multi-municipal plan that followed afterwards, of really trying to make the town center most efficient. You all know we live in a community, in a school district where we have minimal commercial tax base, and to really try to figure out how we could expand that, both in terms of tax-based robustness, but also to maximize the amount of neighborhood services and amenities to the community. And so Borough Council tasked us, either through a historic district or otherwise, to try to revamp the zoning in a way that would kind of put a shine on the town center, make people want to invest in the area. And Suzanne has talked both about the incredible effort that went into developing that 2001 document, which continues to grow, but also the limitations that it provided. There were people who submitted their own property but didn't know anything about it. There were properties like the two that are in question tonight that are handsome buildings, but that people that knew who completed the survey document said these don't qualify to be National Register eligible or as a contributing structure in a National Register district, where the requirement for those buildings are a little bit lesser. The other issue that's been touched on tonight is the eclectic nature of our downtown. We have Michael's Corner with its, I'm not an architect, so don't make me talk about the details, but that's a Tudor structure. We have the Hanson Shire building. We have the bank. The train station is more of a Frank Furness style building. We have so much different type of architecture, but none of it really fits together. And frankly, there's a lot of stuff in between that really doesn't have a lot of character at all. So what we could have done, which really didn't make sense, what Susanna has said is absolutely true. National Register provides recognition. Local designation requires protection. So we knew that the structures in whole, we could not put together an application for a National Register because there just wasn't enough there. And we'd go through all that work and it wouldn't have provided anything other than maybe a gold star for the town center, but no protections for the building. So the other options are two Pennsylvania planning options. One is called this Act 167. And what that requires, as Susanna said, this was just the beginning. We would have had to have updated the survey to make sure that every building in the town center was included in the survey and that as much research about them as possible could be completed. Because as a voluntary survey, what ended up happening was that some buildings in town were included and other buildings that might be equally or of more value weren't. And so we talked about this for the town center, but we were also considering it for other neighborhoods in the community. So think about this. If you put your building, your residence on the directory and your neighborhood or tract becomes designated as district and then certain constraints are placed on your property, but your neighbor didn't put their property on the listing, you might in the future be constrained in additions you can make, even color choices, whatever. So we knew that from a legal perspective, we needed to be very careful. The other thing was an additional preservation plan would have been required and would have required the buy-in of all of the downtown property owners. That seemed like a hard sell at the time. We talked to Borough Council, we explained that these were the issues. They didn't say, go update the survey, we'll apply for more grant funds. They didn't say, try harder. That, they understood. The second option was sort of a relaxed version of that, which you can do through the municipal planning code. And I'm not a zoning planner at all, I do economic development. But my understanding of that is that it would be more relaxed and it would be much more based on kind of the character of the town and I wish that I hadn't just used that word. But really more about the, let me see what I wrote here. The physical form of the town, massing, setback, step back on higher levels, the ratio of windows to solid space in terms of in a commercial district. You want it to be very inviting. You want to see what people are selling inside. You want there to be big open windows. And so that kind of regulation is more interesting to us because we didn't necessarily think we had enough historic stock to use that, but that's very reminiscent of another type of zoning that came into being in the 1980s, 1990s called form-based zoning, form-based code. And that really thinks more about how uses work together to create a vibrant community place. So you're not talking about this commercial building has offices and for every 1,000 square feet of office you must provide one parking space. And that's the old form of zoning. This was much more talking about how do we think about creating a town center area that allows for mixed-use development and invites people in the first floor and has big open windows. And frankly, because we knew that there were a lot of underperforming properties in the downtown, that allows for redevelopment. And that was something that we took on and we knew, and as you discussed, much of the language in this code really is oriented towards new development and encouraging new development. And the reason for that is that a lot of what we have is small, irregularly configured. Much of it is not accessible from the street, 3-4 steps up in terms of the 110 building, way back from the street. And so the idea of allowing for new development to create spaces that were more uniform, if multiple buildings were assembled and redeveloped, that allowed the opportunity to pay for the cost of elevators to service upper floors, and that would allow for the development of accessible space for people in the community, including older Swarthmoreans, but others as well who want to live in the downtown and want to have access to the regional train. So that's what we did instead of historic, and that's the town center zoning code. In front of us tonight is where we ended at the end of this process.
And so that the planning commission, after considering it, did not recommend the creation of historic.
It did not.
Okay. And then you, as you say, you turned your attention to the ordinance itself. And did the planning commission draft the provisions that wound up in the ordinance adopted by Borough Council? And by that I don't mean the exact specific form of language, but all the concepts.
Absolutely, yes. None of us were zoning lawyers. We passed on our concepts to the borough manager and Borough Council.
And what was the reasoning behind the conditional use requirement for the issuance of demolition permits?
We recognized that there was real purpose in having more oversight about proposed new development. It would be relevant at any point in time, but we happen to be doing this work at the tail end or a few years into the recession. And there were many instances around the region where people were purchasing older buildings on the cheap, and construction crews were available, and without much effort at all, they would pull a demo permit and knock down a building, put a fence around it, and lo and behold, maybe wouldn't be able to get construction financing, maybe really didn't have a great development concept in place, maybe didn't have a tenant. And so there were a lot of fenced up spaces and communities, not unlike Swarthmore. For any of you who can't think of an example of this, I can give you a very big one, which is the corner of 8th and Chestnut in downtown Philadelphia. It was the former Gimbel's department store. I believe it was 12, 13 stories tall. It was demolished by a Chicago-based developer in the late 1980s. So then it became a surface parking lot right across from the Litz Brothers building. major commercial corridor in Philadelphia. And then they didn't have a plan because they were allowed to demolish that building without any more control. And then within 10 years, Disney bought that building. And they said, we're going to build a huge indoor Disney facility. And they excavated 3-4 stories down for this property. And finally, if you look at it today, it's been refilled. It's a surface parking lot with a little bit of greenery on the side, but it's just been a huge hole in Chestnut Street scenery. So obviously it wouldn't be so big here, but we really wanted to make sure that no one could just go ahead and demolish a building without more checks by you. And so what we did was we suggested that a conditional use be applied to demolition, which is arbitrary. Like you said, most conditional uses are uses that are permanent. And this is a conditional use that is a snapshot in time, but understanding that the conditional use requires there to be a development plan. I'm not talking anything about this development, a development plan, in order for the demolition permit to be allowed. And the language about the historic structures was just to make sure that those buildings would not be demolished right away. It didn't give them any particular protection because there was no protection given by an ordinance or any national or local designation. But just to say that demolition must not occur without there being zoning already approved.
Now, was the intent at all to prevent new development?
Absolutely not. And I think one thing that we did not want to do was prevent additional development, and I think that's really one of the dangers about interpreting this provision to say that anything that's old cannot be demolished, because, and I'm sorry if I sound cold about this, but I think the fear is that anyone in the future who wants to redevelop a property in Swarthmore, what would they have to do so if that property was over 50 years old? That's called demolition by neglect. They would have to make sure, the only provision would be that if a property is structurally unsound, you would be allowed to demolish it, and you would be granted the conditional use. And this happens in other communities, and the last thing that was on Borough Council's mind when it tasked us with trying to figure out what would be the type of ordinance that would best bring investment to the town center, the last thing that they would want would be for property owners to slap off on maintenance of their buildings just so that they would deteriorate over time. Because then what happens? Their quality tenants get discouraged and they leave. They have a hard time attracting other good tenants. It has a ripple effect around the other buildings. And so I think it's a misreading of the ordinance to say because a building is old, it should not be demolished because it has a negative effect. I want you to think about the conditional use being really a moment in time, because that's the way that we imagined it in the planning commission.
Are you familiar with the existing buildings at 102, 104, and 110, 112 Park Avenue?
I am. I have not been in the rear buildings, and I have not been upstairs, but I have been in the first floor of all of those buildings, yes.
Do you believe that demolition of those buildings would have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center? I
do not. I think, like Susanna said, they are freestanding buildings. They are at the edge of the commercial district. The town center, if they were not there, buildings would be required to be built closer to at least the 110 building would be required to be built closer to the curb line for continuity of the commercial district. They would be accessible to the community, and I think that's really important. They're not really in keeping with an inviting and inclusive town center.
I have no further questions.
Thanks.
There we go. Real quick, you testified regarding the building at 8 Chestnut that was torn down in the 1980s and 1990s. When the demolition conditional use provision that we're here under tonight was drafted, was that demolition in the back of the minds of the
Oh,
planning commission?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, that and there's others in a lot of suburban communities.
Right.
There were many instances of fenced up, and you think of it as in a commercial district as a missing tooth. Lots of missing teeth in the continuity of a commercial district.
Okay. So you would say that the ordinance was drafted with a mind that they didn't want developers to be able to demolish buildings without a plan that could be built after.
Correct.
Would you say that if a building didn't have a valid zoning permit, that it would not be in keeping with that spirit?
And I'm sorry, this is where I'm not a zoning person. By zoning permit, do you mean that the
I'm
zoning
gonna
officer?
I'm going to object to the question of the term valid zoning permit.
Okay,
I'm not clear what that means.
sure, let me rephrase it a little bit. If a plan didn't have zoning approval under the Swarthmore zoning code, specifically our code, would that play into whether or not the demolition ordinance as drafted would prevent demolition?
And let me answer this question this way and see if you're okay with it. What I testified and what I believed that our intent was to indicate that in order for a demolition permit, for the conditional use to be granted for a demolition permit, that the zoning officer of the borough would have had to agree that the development plan before him or her met the zoning code.
Right, okay. And if that weren't the case, then the demolition permit shouldn't issue. No more questions, thank you.
All three witnesses have touched on one thing, and then since you're here now, I'll ask you. There seems to be an implication that Michael's Corner and Shire Building are somehow different or more protected in some way than Sealy Building and 110 Park. So I just want to clarify a couple things on that. One is that neither Michael's Corner nor Shire qualifies for the National Register. Is that correct?
Now, I'm not the historian, and I don't know if I need to call this up, but I just made a copy of the introduction to the historic survey, which I have here somewhere. Here it is. And I don't know if you ever looked at the survey, the historic 2001 survey?
Go ahead.
Okay, what I know on this is that the list in the survey recommendations indicates that several, and I'm just quoting what Delaware County Planning Department says. C, specific individual sites outside of proposed districts that the Delaware County Planning Commission believes to be worthy of National Register status, which is, and it says, does not mean they would granted it, but might be eligible for. Michael's Corner, and the ones in the town center are Michael's Corner, Swarthmore train station, the Shire Building.
Okay. So there is some different designation for them, even though it's not officially recognized at this point. Is that right?
By designation, they are, unfortunately at this point, they are no more protected than any other structure in the town.
That was going to be my next point. Question for you. If you would agree that for the purposes of this hearing, these buildings should be treated the same way as a hearing for the demolition of those two buildings.
Objection. That's the question it means. For the purposes of this hearing, they should be treated the same way as those other buildings.
I'll try to rephrase it. Okay. So there seems to be an implication that things would operate differently if those two buildings were being considered, but
No, actually no, because there are no historic protections to any buildings in Swarthmore.
I think you just answered my question. So it's the same process tonight as we would undergo for those two buildings. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I have something I often get confused about in these discussions in the various meetings that we've had, and that is when you're talking about significant impact to the character of the town for legal reasons, because we're discussing demolition, we can only talk about whether or not demolition of the buildings will have a significant impact on the character of the town. But like you said, it's hard to, there's really a connection between what the demolition process and then what's built after. And both of those processes have significant impacts on the character of the town. So I'm wondering from your perspective and in your experience, how you disentangle those when you're talking about character of the town.
I'm talking from the character of, the zoning relates to the character of the architecture, the physical stock of the town. And I'm not here to talk about any future development. I'm talking about the idea that if the zoning officer and the borough council approve the next development, the demolition itself as a midway point, I don't think can be considered as a naturally negative impact on the
Even
community.
if the demolition then leads to, if the demolition is approved, it then leads to the building. You can disentangle them, I guess, in terms of their impact on character. Well, I'm just curious, I don't quite understand how all of these, like how you can separate those.
Well, I think, I guess I'm not separating it. And I'm saying that if people say that taking away a building and then having a vacant lot is a negative impact on the community, I don't think that that's a fair way to look at it. You have to understand that something else will take its place that will have gotten approval. And I will leave a lot of the historic preservation evaluation to architects and people who have design backgrounds, but they have said that these two structures are not in any way unique or particularly special, and in fact have some limitations. And that's the basis for my...
I guess I'm just I have a hard time mentally separating out the fact that if this is approved and those two buildings are demolished, then the developers have the ability to go ahead and do their project. So I have a hard time separating those two processes when I think about the impact of this proposed project on the character of the town.
But that's what, I understand what you're saying, because tonight is not about that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Enrico's had his hand raised.
Good evening, Laurie. Just to follow up on a couple of the other questions that were asked, and I understand you are not a zoning attorney, so if you're not comfortable, please state so. But your understanding of the municipal planning code is that a conditional use is a permitted use that the governing body, in this case Borough Council, has the opportunity to place conditions upon.
Correct.
So, to one of the questions that was asked earlier, would it be conceivable, in your opinion, again, if you're not comfortable, but that an approval of the conditional use based on the intent of the planning commission when they adopted this ordinance would be that the demolition could not occur prior to an applicant getting zoning and land development approval?
Yes, that's what I think I was answering earlier.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Dow? No, any other party questions? Council?
Council, Marty?
I hate to keep beating this horse, but it's why we're here tonight, I think. Or when the planning commission that you served on was debating and deliberating the issue of historic preservation or developing the current ordinance, and did not provide specific protective language in there. Was that a conscious decision?
Yes.
It wasn't just an omission.
No.
It wasn't, you forgot to mention anything about it. You made a decision.
We chose Plan B.
Oh.
Yeah.
And you explained before why you decided to do that. Now, I think Al explained the issue regarding why we're here in conditional use. You know, getting to the council's question here. Nothing will, if conditional use is granted by council, it still is incumbent upon the applicants to get the approval of the land development plan before these buildings can come down.
Correct.
So just the granting of conditional use does not mean that tomorrow bulldozers can come in and tear these buildings down.
And it would be a pretty financially risky decision for them to do so.
This is the part, kind of the almost the initial part of a process that will be ongoing.
Correct.
When people will have an opportunity to discuss the proposed buildings that are proposed for this property.
The design, the circulation,
I think people need to understand that nothing, just if council were to approve conditional use and the demolition of these buildings, that does not mean they can come down until the land use development plan has been approved by council as well.
Correct. And Bill, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as the zoning officer, you have approved the massing of the building. You have said that its scale, setback, etc., meets the zoning code, correct? I'm sorry, is he allowed? Oh, never mind.
The questions go to you, not they flow that one.
So that is what has happened to date.
Thank you. So if I understand, prior to 2013, demolition to any of these buildings could have just happened by right?
Yeah, we did not have, you could have applied for a demolition permit, but there wasn't, you didn't have to be this far along in the process. You could just say, I purchased the property and I want to take it down.
So the 2013 actually puts some safeguards on.
Absolutely.
By having a plan.
Yeah.
That you had to have before.
Correct.
One thing, if you could help me, because I'm not a planning person, zoning person, I wasn't sure where historic value first shows up in our code. It's only to a layperson reads a very simple definition of historic value for our code, which is it's just on that list. And there's no subsequent action about sending it, to get on the historic preservation. It just really reads like the simple thing is historic value is it's on that list that we talked about. And then what confuses me is that same language recurs under the demolition code, that same definition, simple definition of historic value. What was the intent around that simple definition?
I have to say that this is one area that when I looked at the code many years later, kind of confused me. I think we drafted the ordinance. I don't remember the planning commission ever stating the definition, went into the definition section. I do know that we wanted to make sure that any property in downtown, and knowing that most were on the historic resources survey, would get that extra checkpoint, the hoop that a developer had to jump through. But I agree, it's a little awkward that it says that and then includes the whole list of, because we don't have any national, well, not in the town center, we don't have any national registered listed or designated properties.
Thank you so much.
So you were part of drafting 1256.06? Well, that's the whole substantial effect.
Yes, the text, it became codified this way when it left our committee, but yes, we drafted
Thanks a lot. No, seriously, how lucky are we to have somebody here who is there and who can talk about, to the best of her ability, what was intended. So, thank you for being here. So, the character question, I just want to get your take on that. Does it relate to the built environment in your view, or to the sort of more social, emotional attachment?
As it relates to zoning, it relates to the built environment.
Okay. And do you think we should be able to, this may not be a fair question, so feel free just to tell me it's not fair. In our assessment of character, do you think we should be able to consider the plan, the development plan, when we assess character? In other words, what's replacing, what will replace a building that would be demolished? Are we able to consider that in our assessment of whether character is impacted negatively?
I would say no, because I think, and first I'm going to protect myself here. I want to take the blame for having drafted this, but I had many other partners, and I want to say it was a really well-balanced planning commission at the time. We had 3 to 4 architects. We had someone who had been on a historic architectural review board from another community who said, no, we can't do that here. We had a cost estimator, we had a transportation planner, we had several attorneys. So I didn't really have very much to the table. But what we tried to do, and I learned so much, the architects really walked us through this in terms of massing and scale and talking it. And another thing to remember at the time, it was rearing its head, but the inn was on the prospect. And we knew that that was going to be a larger scale development. You know, that Town Center West is part of the town center. We talked about, you know, height and this, and the architects really helped for people like me who were more math people. They really brought to, we understood what they were talking about in terms of what this magnitude of development that's being proposed here might mean in different parts of the community. And we were all on board. It was unanimous. I wasn't the chair at the time, but it was passed out of the Planning Commission unanimously. So when I say no, I think that's because, as vague as it is to me, and I think there's a lot of allowances in saying, please conform to exactly what's here now, but be creative. We're trying to say, we have a lot of character, it's eclectic, try to play off of that, but if we're having major new investment, we want that to be, it's a building in its own right. 100 years from now, we want people to be saying, let's preserve that. So I don't know that you can subjectively say right now, I don't really like what's going on in this or another development. I think you have to say if it meets the standard of the zoning code based on those architectural characteristics and requirements that are laid out, that it should.
Thank you.
David?
Good evening. Would you agree that in the town center there's not a lot of vacant parcels to develop on?
I don't know of any vacant parcels to develop on.
I would concur. So you use the term redevelop and new develop. Do you use them interchangeably?
I probably have, and I wasn't normally, it's the town center revitalization strategy. You restore buildings that are older, you revitalize town centers with a mix of restoration and redevelopment, and redevelopment usually means new development on the site of either a vacant lot or a former building.
Thank you.
Okay, no more. Next witness.
Yes, the next witness is Dorothy Ives Dewey.
Will you state your full name, please?
I want to test this with the mask. Can everybody hear me if I keep the mask on? Yes. Okay, thank you. My name is Dorothy Ives.
Will you raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Dorothy, what is your address?
Oh, it's 40 Branch Avenue in Berwick.
And what is your occupation or profession?
I am currently a professor of planning at Westchester University. Previously, I was a professional land use planner.
And how long have you been involved in land planning?
For about 30 years now, if you include both my time as a professional planner, about 15 years as a professional planner, and I'm 17 years now, full-time on the faculty of Westchester.
And we marked your resume, or excuse me, your CV for purposes of identification, and I believe it's age 16. I don't have a copy of my exhibits list right in front of me. Is that correct, age 16? Okay. We've marked it for purposes of identification, age 16. Is the information contained on your CV true and correct?
Yes, it is.
And what is your educational background?
I have an undergraduate degree from Lafayette College in civil engineering. I have a master's of urban and regional planning from the University of Southern California. And I have a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of Pennsylvania.
I'm sorry, what was your PhD in?
It's a city and regional planning.
City and regional. And what do the designations of AICP and PP, which periodically means?
Sure. AICP is the American Institute of Certified Planners. That's a professional credential that's available to practicing planners. And it signifies you work for a period of time and then pass a comprehensive exam to earn an AICP. So it's and then you also have to get regular continuing education credits. So it's a credential that indicates that you're keeping up with trends and tools and things in planning, and that you subscribe to a code of ethics. Oh yes, and then the PP. The PP stands for professional planner, and that is specific to the state of New Jersey. New Jersey is really the only state in the union that has a separate licensing for professional planners. So the PP signifies that you pass the planning law exam for New Jersey, and that you also have earned your AICP.
Could you please just summarize your employment history? It's all spelled out, I think, very well in your CV.
Sure. So, as I said, I worked for about 15 years as a professional planner in the region. For first 4 years, I actually worked for a private real estate development company. Then I was 2 years with a nonprofit economic development organization, actually in the city of Camden. And then the rest of the time, I worked for two private planning consulting firms, the Thomas Committa Associates and a firm called Black & Thomas Panzak, located in Paoli. And then in 2005, I took a position full-time at Westchester University as a faculty member in the geography and planning department.
And have you written in the field of planning?
I have some, as you can see on my CV, I have some peer-reviewed publications that were published in academic journals, planning journals, applied geography journals, a law review journal. And then I also have what we sometimes call commissioned research, which were more professionally oriented publications, mostly for municipalities, but sometimes for other nonprofit organizations, that the work that was done sometimes with students, but it was work that was primarily done during the time that I've been on the faculty at Westchester.
On page 4 of your CV, it lists several professional planning projects and work projects. One of those items is Radnor Township Historic Preservation Ordinance. What did that involve?
Yeah. So I served on the Planning Commission at Radnor Township for a number of years, for about 8 years. And during that time, Radnor updated its comprehensive plan. And one thing that became very obvious through that process, similar to what we're talking about here, is that Radnor had a number of historic properties. Some individual properties that were on the National Register, others that were regarded as being important properties, historic properties to Radnor. And there were also two historic districts at the time, the North Wayne Historic District and the South Wayne Historic District, both of which had gone through the process of, they were both on the National Register. But at the time there were, again, as we've been talking about, there were no protections in place to protect any of the properties in either the districts or the individual properties. So I worked with a group to actually draft the first set of historic preservation regulations to bring some regulatory weight to the protection of the district. So we chose to not do a broad ordinance that would protect all of the individual properties, but to use the Act 167 and to just focus on the two historic districts. So the ordinance, in effect, created a historic and architectural review board. And so we went through an extensive process to educate the community on what it would mean to have a HARB, what it would mean if you owned a property in one of those districts. It was not an easy process, as you can imagine. It was very time consuming. But ultimately, the ordinance did get passed. And so now there is a HARB in Radnor. Interestingly, the South Wayne District did not want to be part of the HARB to start. It only covered the North Wayne District. Later, the South Wayne District became part of it, and now there's actually a third historic district in Radnor that is also governed under the HARB. So these were two primarily residential districts that that were surrounding the Wayne Business District, and they were two districts that had evolved in around the late 1800s or early 1900s. And again, a HARB is now in place, which I could get into. I was interested in the details of what that means. But in effect, that is what I was referring to in the CD.
So there's a detailed process that somebody goes through, including going to the HARB board when they want to make renovations or demolish or whatever they want to do with the property.
Yeah, so any kind of development that happens within the historic district, you have to first go to the HARB. The HARB is an advisory body to the governing body. The governing body ultimately has the power to issue, it's called a certificate of appropriateness to enable demolition, new construction, alteration to the buildings. And so the HARB is an advisory body. So you first go to the HARB. And we really try to envision the HARB as being more of an educational resource. Not everybody sees it that way, but they see this as another level of regulation. But I think it's, I don't live in Radnor anymore, and I haven't really tracked it too much, but it's still in place. It hasn't been overturned. I think that was one thing that we repeatedly said as we're getting it put in place. It's always easy to overturn these if it's not working, but it's been in place now for about 17 years.
Okay. Now, are you aware that the applicants have filed a conditional use application in connection with their intention to demolish the existing structures on the properties of 102-104 and 100-112 Park Avenue in Swarthmore Borough to make way for development of a mixed-use building combining commercial and residential, for which a zoning permit has been issued by the Borough Zoning Officer?
Yes.
And have you reviewed section 1256.06 of the Town Center Zoning District Regulations, which is titled Demolition?
Yes.
Have you also reviewed the conditional use application procedures outlined in section 1264.11 of the zoning ordinance?
Yes.
Please summarize what else you did and what else you reviewed in preparation for your testimony in your services in this matter?
Sure. So I had an opportunity to tour the Swarthmore Town Center. I reviewed the development plans. I reviewed a number of the planning documents related to the town center, including the borough's 2006 multi-municipal comprehensive plan, the 1999 revitalization plan, the 2030 vision plan. I also had an opportunity to speak with Sharon Nestor and Beth Murray of the Vision 2030 task force.
And are you aware that section 1256.06A2 provides that for a building of historic value as defined in the Borough Zoning Code, which includes anything contained in the Historic Resources Survey published 2021, for anything on that list to be demolished, it must be demonstrated that demolition of the building will not have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center?
Yes, I'm aware.
Are you aware that of the 4 buildings on the property in question, the buildings in front of 102, 104 Park Avenue and 110, 112 Park Avenue, commonly known as 110 Park Avenue, are included in Swarthmore Borough's Historic Resources Survey of 2001, and that the buildings in the rear of those properties are not included in the survey?
Yes.
In your opinion, will the demolition of the building in the front of 102, 104 Park Avenue and the demolition of the building in the front of 110, 112 Park Avenue for the purpose of redevelopment with a mixed-use building for which a zoning permit has been issued have a substantial negative effect on the character of the town center?
I believe that demolition to make way for the redevelopment will not have this in 2 ways. First, as we were just talking about with the previous witness, the way the zoning ordinance is currently structured, there are safeguards in place whereby a demolition permit is not issued until there is a zoning permit in place. And in this case, with the proposed redevelopment, there is, it has a zoning permit, which indicates that it meets the standards of the ordinance. So I think procedurally, because those safeguards in place, you don't run the risk of having, as Laura talked about, a vacant lot that sits there for a long period of time. But then I'll also address the character question in a different way. Pull up the one image of the entire district. I think that one will work. In considering the standards that are in place in the town center zoning district, I think when you're thinking about character of this district, the standards apply to the entire district. And so it's my opinion that you have to get away from just thinking about character just in relation to those 2 properties and what surrounds them, but really think about what is the overall character of the town center and how has it been conceptualized in planning documents and through the development of the zoning code. And looking at this district, it's a very concentrated, unique district in the borough of Swarthmore. It's anchored by a train station, which I think is important. I think that the standards that were developed recognize we're trying to promote, what we sometimes think of as transit-oriented development. There's a lot of logic to having higher, more intense development closer to the train stations so that you can get more people out of their cars, have more trips on the train station. But I think that the town center plays a very unique role in the borough of Swarthmore. It is at your heart, it's your town center. It's, as we talked about, it's evolved over time. It has a very unique nature. You've got commercial uses, you've got government uses, you've got residential uses, it's mixed use, it's pedestrian oriented. And I believe that the standards that were put in place in the ordinance were put in place in order, specifically the design standards. There seems to be, and I was not involved with this, but a lot of attention to the design standards and to ensure that new development would be complementary to the goals of the district, to keep it pedestrian-oriented, pedestrian-focused, with the attention to stepping back the buildings. It's a very common way with taller buildings to maintain the pedestrian nature on the street itself. So again, I'll answer that question by saying that I believe that the standards that are in place in the ordinance are consistent with good town center planning and appropriate to what was looking to be achieved at the time, to help to revitalize the downtown and to create a vibrant, viable, the word is used a lot, economically viable, functional town center.
And did you also, but you think demolishing those buildings is not going to have a substantial negative effect?
No, I don't believe that, again, the way the ordinance is set up, demolishing the buildings and having the demolition tied to a new development that complies with zoning will not have a substantial negative effect on the character.
And have you reviewed section 1264.11 of the zoning ordinance, which is referenced in section, that was 1264.11, which is referenced in section 1256.06 and is titled Conditional Uses?
Yes.
And those, basically the procedure, it goes to the planning commission for a recommendation and it goes to the governing body for the degree that we're having today. That's the whole procedure that's set forth. But there is reference to 7 standards, which I generally would call the general conditional use standards, which are very general and non-specific. But have you reviewed those standards?
Yes.
And assuming for the sake of this question that demolition could be considered a use, because again, these apply to uses, I think the last witness spoke to that. In your opinion, would the demolition of any of the 4 buildings on the subject properties for redevelopment with a building which has received a zoning permit violate any of those 7 standards?
No, I don't believe it will.
And I don't know how you want to handle it, but can you sort of summarize why you feel that way?
Okay. So looking at those 7 items, let me actually just maybe speak a little bit to the first one, which is having to do with consistency with the comprehensive plan and with the spirit, purpose, and intent of the zoning code. There are specific recommendations in the comprehensive plan that speak to this type of development, things like the area, it specifically says area and requirements should be revised to reflect describe it urban and mixed-use character of the district. And it also, there's a specific recommendation for the town center to continue the implementation of the town center revitalization strategy. So I think that demolition is consistent with that. And then in speaking to the spirit, purpose, intent provisions of the zoning ordinance, as Bill had mentioned earlier, there are 7 very broad goals in the intent. First one is to encourage economic viability. The second one speaks to retention of the streetscape by preserving the existing buildings and specifically says of historic significance. It doesn't use the word historic value. It's historic significance, which, as we know, is not defined in the ordinance. And then the other goals speak to a development that maintains visual character, architectural scale, compatibility with the streetscape, encouraging walkability, retaining and enhancing an array of uses, and then it also speaks to parking. So I think that demolition is not in any way inconsistent with any of these. Demolition makes way for the redevelopment.
Now, excuse me for a second. So the standards in the ordinance are designed to encourage compatibility with a new building meeting those standards.
Correct.
And is there anything you would like to add? I neglected to ask you.
I think that pretty well covers
That's all the questions I have.
Any questions?
Robinson?
I'm a bit confused. It's actually not too rare. Bob started the meeting off saying we were looking simply at the impact on character of town center and not on the replacement project. I think you said that. And Jill, didn't you just ask the prior witness the same question, and didn't she also indicate, did I hear her wrong? Are we at this hearing generally looking just at impact on character of downtown and not on the replacement? What would go in place of it? It's not what the prior witness.
I'm not the expert, so.
Well, to correct that question.
Well, it's, my question relies on that. I thought that was the premise of the meeting, and I think your entire testimony was relevant to the new project.
No, it's not true.
No,
It
it's
was
relevant to the demo.
Well, you have a couple quotes, I think, that this would be good going forward if it makes way for this development. And then earlier part of your testimony, you said that you thought there was not a negative impact if it makes room for this specific development.
Well,
that's how I heard it.
Yeah, I don't think I was speaking to the specific development. I was talking about referencing the actual standards that are in the ordinance, not necessarily specific development itself. But
that's not how I heard it, but okay. All right, thank you very much.
Dale, you think? Mr. Federico, tell us. Okay, council?
Can you talk about the environmental impact of demolition?
The specific environmental impact of demolition of these specific
If you
buildings.
could, as specifically as possible, or generally, when you said you walked through in our town center and, kind of sized up this project, what environmental impact would you imagine is
I mean, I have to say, I wouldn't be able to speak specifically. I don't know the nature of the buildings that well to really be able to provide an assessment of what the specific environmental impact would be, the physical and environmental impact. I have to say, I don't think I have enough information to really specifically answer that question.
Then, when you were describing revitalization, and you were saying preserving or enhancing existing structures versus tearing them down and replacing them with something else, could you talk about the comparative environmental impact of taking those two different approaches to revitalization? Which is better for the environment? Or easier?
Well, again, I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I mean, I think it would depend on the nature of the project itself. I mean, you could, if you were to, and again, I'm just talking hypothetically, not to these specific properties, but were you to endeavor to do a development that incorporated some element of the building, I mean, depending on the nature of the materials in the building, what you were saving, what you weren't saving. There are lots of different techniques to be able to do things in ways that are more or less, have more or less of an impact, of an environmental impact. So I'm not sure it's a straight answer to say that always protecting buildings or building around them or protecting some piece of it is always has the least environmental impact. And then there's also the question of what you're building. And with new buildings, you're typically able to build new buildings to environmental standards that are higher than the environmental standards that you find in some of the existing buildings.
And so you're not prepared to assess this project, the environmental impact of tearing down these
I have not completed a full environmental assessment.
But you wrote a bunch of papers about the environmental impact of redevelopment. Are any of those salient here that you can give us a general construct?
Well, I've written papers about, I've had published papers related to climate planning and land use planning that's more or less favorable to the climate. And one thing that's a pretty well established principle in terms of climate planning is that you want to have higher density development in particular areas and communities, particularly in districts that are close to train stations. So that's where I see with this project, again, not being a part of the community, just looking as an outside planner. This is where you want the density. And by putting density into certain select areas, it enables you to not have to put that density in other places where you wouldn't want that kind of development.
Great, thank you.
So we said we'd be starting at 10, it's 10:15, but this seems like a good break spot. I assume your case is want more than 15 minutes?
More than 15 minutes. I could at least make an opening for the board, and then we can go from there. All right.
Well, Mr. Richardson done? I would move for the admission of the exhibits. Can I just check with Michael about one issue? With that, we'll rest, so please.
So, Mr. Young.
Sure. And this will be very brief. Mr. Petroso tonight made use of the term valid. A zoning permit has been issued by Mr. Webb multiple times, and that fact is true. On April 11th, a zoning permit was issued. What hasn't really been discussed this evening was that on April 5th, within 10 days of that zoning permit issuing, an appeal to the zoning hearing board of the Borough of Swarthmore was issued. In that moment, under the MPC, exclusive jurisdiction over the issues of zoning vested in the zoning hearing board. Now, I'm not going to get into the legal arguments behind the zoning arguments that have been asserted by State Law Swarthmore, but suffice it to say is, I do not believe that this board can rely upon a valid zoning permit at this time. I know Mr. Petroso disagrees with me on this one, but without a ruling from the zoning hearing board, compliance with the zoning code is not established. And therefore, I would say that a zoning permit, a demolition permit, and conditional use cannot issue, because the borough zoning code is clear. No permit for demolition shall be approved until the applicant has received a zoning permit for a new building, which has issued, that demonstrates compliance with all codes of the Borough of Swarthmore. That is the crux that I do not believe is established with the appeal to the zoning hearing board. So with that, we respectfully would object to this board, this body, issuing a decision on conditional use at this time. We've appealed to the zoning hearing board on a number of issues worth of zoning use that for the proposed for the new building, issues of the scale compared to what exists in the town center, issues of complying with the intent of the town center district itself, which specifically includes the reuse of historic buildings, the preservation to the greatest extent. So for that reason, I would assert that this body should not act on a conditional use application at this time. Thank you.
Council, question?
Yeah.
Do you have any case law or statutory support for your position that because the zoning decision by the zoning hearing officer is on appeal to the zoning board that we cannot proceed on this?
Specifically on this, I do not have a case that says that. What I have is that says an appeal from an issuance of a permit, that's exclusive jurisdiction over zoning in the zoning hearing board.
Does it invalidate the permit that's been issued?
I do not have case law on that.
Okay, thank you.
Are you saying that if we were to approve the conditional use application, a permit automatically is issued, or the zoning questions need to be heard for the zoning hearing board before the permit can issue? Are you clumping those together, or are you separating them?
As I understand it, and from a letter from the borough, that no demolition permit will issue until all appeals have been exhausted. So the conditional use approval would not, well, should not trigger a demolition permit to issue.
Correct. Thank you.
Since we're talking law here, as opposed to witnesses, you'd agree that we could continue with this hearing and go figure out your position?
Right, I've noted the objection, but right, for the purpose of a record, correct.
But, so, if council, so there's two ways this can go. Council's going to vote to deny this application, or council's going to vote to approve this application.
Correct.
If council votes to approve this application, I'm going to recommend, I think it's a matter of law, that it be conditioned upon them getting, it's going to be conditioned upon them getting a zoning, having exhausted their appeals on the zoning issue. So they're going to have 3 other approvals in place before this project can proceed, in addition to this approval, if in fact it happens.
Understood. Thank you.
And with that, you're good.
I think we'll rest.
Okay, so.
You don't mean you're done completely. Are you going to put any witnesses on?
No.
No.
Okay.
All right, so.
Okay, so, all right. So do any of the other parties intend to put on testimony or present evidence? If not, we may be done tonight, which we didn't anticipate. Ms. Dow, please.
So, can I ask a question of you? Why are you not putting witnesses on?
She asked Mr. McGowan why he's not putting on witnesses.
That's his decision.
Okay. Just wondering.
Thank you.
Question 2.
Can I ask you to explain the 3 other approvals that would happen after this?
So there needs to be, well, there has been there's 4 approvals that are needed. The issuance of a zoning permit, the conditional use approval, a land development plan approval, and a building permit. And a building permit is both a demolition permit and a building permit under the building code. it's a permit that is reviewed by the building code official and issued by that person if it complies with the building code. And if the demolition is going to comply with demolition standards, dust control, things like that. The zoning permit has been issued, but it is under appeal. This hearing is on conditional use. The next item that the developer would need to obtain is a land development plan approval, which is where they're going to present full, land development plans for their proposed project. And then finally, the building permit will follow after that. Although they don't have to follow in that sequence, normally they don't apply for a building permit until they've got the land development approval. It's plan commission first and then council. Now, the land development plan approval is largely a matter of engineers giving you those. It is, the standard is the plans they submit comply with the borough's subdivision and land development ordinance. And you cannot, if you're going to deny a land development plan, you have to list what, with the parts of the ordinance it does not comply with. It is not a discretionary matter. It is much more of a perfunctory asking your engineer, does this comply or not? So,
Question.
When is zoning hearing board meeting?
we're aiming for, today I spoke with council for both parties, and I believe we've landed on July 6th. July? I've got the 19th on my calendar, July 19th.
After speaking, looking over the calendars today, I sent Mr. Kelly an email requesting that we open the hearing on July 6th, 9th, and 7th, because everyone was available, with the exception of Mr. Callen. But according to the applicant's attorney today, they would make accommodation to proceed, because...
Well, I'm away that week, and I don't know if my colleague will be available, but I can check. So we're not going to answer that question tonight. But we're aiming for the month of July on the zoning hearing. Zoning hearing board. Right.
That zoning hearing board decision can be appealed by either party.
By either party or by the borough. But the borough can appeal its own zoning hearing board's decision in the district.
And as Mary has instructed me, that's to common pleas.
Correct.
And this Mr. Giardino can also be to
By any right by a party who is just.
Could you speak into the microphone?
Yes.
Sure.
Sure. Okay. So, if the parties have rested, council. We didn't decide anything. We're talking about the.
But you were explaining a process.
Yes.
Could you just summarize that process so that we can understand what it is back here?
Okay.
Thank you.
So, I talked about how there are 4 approvals that are needed for this project. One is the zoning permit. One is a conditional use approval, which is the purpose of tonight's meeting. The next is a land development plan approval, which will go before the plan commission and council. And finally, a building permit and a demolition permit that goes before the building code official. The zoning permit has issued, but it is under appeal. The zoning hearing board will hear that appeal. We're aiming for the month of July. We were talking schedule, we determined we don't know what the date is yet because there's been some miscommunication, some misunderstanding. We're aiming for the month of July for the zoning hearing board appeal. I think that's where we left it.
Well, we talked about the appeal rights from the zoning hearing board,
You can appeal to the Court of Common Pleas, and people who are parties can appeal this decision that we made also to the Court of Common Pleas. Actually,
Yeah, to
yeah.
the Supreme
You
Court.
could go to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
And what's happened in Swarthmore?
Yes, it has. But that is what was said. That's what you just said. You're welcome.
So with that, council's options are to make a decision tonight, to consider the evidence and testimony and make a decision another night, in which case we would continue this meeting to another night. And your options are to approve it, deny it, approve it with conditions. Oh, you're right, I'm sorry. Now that we're done with the parties' cases, it is now time for public comment. We said we were going to stop at 10, but if the cases are done, council okay with going on and trying to wrap this up in one night? No?
Hold on, please.
So-
Why do people want to make public comment tonight after they heard the testimony? Well, you have a lawyer, we'll let him answer why. Your client has to.
Well, do I have standing? There seemed to be some debate about
Your organization has standing. So, yes.
He's allowed to make a comment as a private citizen.
Oh, sure.
Oh,
Sure.
sorry.
So if the question from the solicitor, so if we set aside Tuesday the 24th as another night of this hearing, we would come back that night and just start with public comment?
Sure,
But
that's an
is it
option.
going to be from the people who were here this evening, or is it going to be for whoever shows up Tuesday?
It could be either anyone who's there that night will be able to make public comment, whether they were here for the testimony or not.
Okay.
Can I ask a
Yes. Yes. About which? All of it? Yeah, I think so.
I think it makes sense to have folks who are here that could be able to.
Yeah, I do too. Give us 1 second, okay? Thank you.
I mean, I don't want to stay here all night either, but I think it makes sense to people that took the time to come here tonight and heard the same evidence that we've heard.
Yeah.
Be allowed to make comment on their decision.
Do the parties have anything to say about that, or can they?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's entirely at the board's discretion. The only issue I had is that I found in these situations, sometimes people will comment tonight, they'll come back again and comment on the 24th, sometimes it's the same.
Well, I think if
But
they comment tonight and we get through all of it, then I think it goes to the point where we're deciding.
Right.
Yes. I actually am not in favor of that. I don't want this to go on any longer than it has to. However, I know that there are people that are invested and have left. Maybe they're watching at home and they can't be here to comment. And I do think it's fair, most fair, to allow the public to comment. And at this hour, I'm pretty sure the public is not here.
Well, and we advertised
that we were done at 10.
And Bob, I know you said approximately 10, but there's a natural breaking point. So to me, I think I feel like we're going to come back and take it again.
People may have thought that another night
Yeah,
was
that's fine.
guaranteed and therefore.
So how will Tuesday work?
So I would ask council to make a motion to continue this meeting until Tuesday at 7. At that point, the meeting will be limited to public comment because the parties have rested. And it will be for purposes of public comment. At the conclusion of that, you can make a decision, or again, you do not need to make a decision for 45 days, if I recall, but that's up to council to decide whether you need more time or not.
All right, so then, based on what the solicitor just said, I'm going to ask for a motion to...
Please, before you do that, I'm sorry. I'm not wanting to drag this out, but you said the parties had rested, and I don't think I really understand what my options to party are now.
As a party, you can present your arguments, testimony, evidence about how this is going to impact you in particular, not, if it's going to have a particular impact on you. This is your opportunity to put
May I
that
do that?
evidence.
I live right next door. May I do that? Sure. I'm sorry, everybody. And also, this is how it impacts me. It's not about character of town center. So, I live 15 feet away from this proposed demolition and construction of a beautiful view of a courtyard right now. It will be replaced by a 5-story wall 15 feet away from all my windows. I'm quite concerned about the end result in terms of the impact on my building, the tenants in my building, the owners in my building, financially, quality of life. One particular aspect is the whole side of my building, west facing, now gets a lot of sun, beautiful winter sun. Some prior public comments have addressed the shade issue. I would actually ask that you all, how do you separate character of town center and what will be there? I mean, if it was going to be a parking lot there, would you have the same decision? So if it's not completely separated, can there be a shade study? What's the impact on surrounding buildings? That part of town center. Obviously, the process itself is going to be extremely disruptive for near neighbors. 107 Rutgers, 114 Park, 100 Park. And I wonder what, if anything, will be done to accommodate those people. When will if this goes through, when will the demolition construction happen? What time of day? 6 days a week, 5 days a week? Noise abatement, traffic, safety issues for near neighbors. So these are all other issues on this topic. I mean, the reality is this is a big thing for Swarthmore, and a big thing maybe in some positive ways, but that's something that really needs to be thought about in terms of impact on the people that live here, the people that live nearby. Thank you very much.
Mr. Richardson, would you just repeat your address like this?
114 Park.
So you're in the...
My windows are 15 feet from the property line.
I did catch that, you said that several times, but it is the apartment building just to the east of the 110.
Yes, it's directly across the street from Borough. Correct.
Thank you.
It's on your slide.
Yeah,
Right next door on your slide.
You're a tenant in that building?
I'm a tenant. That's correct.
I just wanted to understand, that's all.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, that was useful. Okay, so we're going to do public comment on Tuesday night.
Yes.
We're going to do public comment on Tuesday night.
5 seconds.
I just said public comment.
We are not doing public comment
Okay.
tonight. We said we were going to do it at the very end. Thank you.
But we didn't.
Because we're not done.
We also said we'd end at 10 tonight.
Yes.
And we
So we're
continue
trying to
to
end
another
at 10.
night if needed.
So I have to get a motion to adjourn.
Continue.
To continue. May I have a motion? Thank you, Sarah. Is there a second?
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandy.
And that will be continued to 7 p.m. Tuesday,
Until 10 p.m.
7 to 10, May 24, Tuesday in this room.
Back here. And I want to remind the council members that we should not be discussing this or deliberating in any way. We're in the middle of a